Prince Philip died on April 9, 2021, at Windsor Castle, 39 days before his 100th birthday. The official announcement came from Buckingham Palace at midday, and within hours the tributes were running on every channel. The naval career, the Duke of Edinburgh Award, the decades of walking 2 steps behind his wife at official engagements, the sharp humour, the gaffes that had generated their own cottage industry of coverage. The portrait assembled was the portrait of a man who had given himself entirely to the institution, who had subordinated everything personal to the public role, who had been the Queen's steadfast support across 73 years of marriage. Penny Knatchbull was at Windsor Castle when he died. She had been there for the final weeks, in the small circle of people allowed inside the castle during the COVID restrictions that had reduced royal household operations to their minimum. The Queen was there, certain staff were there, and Penny Knatchbull, the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, was there, present at the end of a man's life, in the way that people are present at the end of a life, when the relationship that places them there is the relationship that has mattered most across the years that preceded the ending. The palace said nothing about her presence. The tributes running on every channel said nothing about her presence. The portrait of Philip, assembled in the hours and days and weeks after his death, was a portrait organized around the marriage and the institution and the naval career and the public service. And Penny Knatchbull's name did not appear in it, except in the most peripheral ways, in the accounts of the funeral that noted her presence among the mourners, with the brevity that peripheral figures receive. She was not a peripheral figure. She had been a consistent and documented presence in Philip's private life for more than 4 decades. She had accompanied him to events. She had travelled with him. She had been his companion at the carriage, driving, that was his primary passion in the years after he retired from official duties. She had been present in the private world of Windsor and Sandringham and Balmoral in ways that the people inside the relevant world understood and the people outside it were not informed about. She had been, in every measure available to the observer willing to look at the record carefully, the closest personal relationship of Philip's adult life outside the marriage. The palace never explained it. The official record does not address it. The tributes after his death treated it as though it did not exist. This account is about what the palace never explained, why the explanation was withheld, and what the relationship between Philip and Penny Knatchbull tells us about the man behind the public performance, and about the specific costs of a life lived entirely in the service of an institution that had no mechanism for acknowledging the human beings it consumed. Philip gave the institution everything: his name, his career, his independence, his identity as anything other than the Queen's husband. He gave it 70 years of public service, conducted with a professionalism and a consistency that the people who worked alongside him have described with genuine respect. He gave it the specific suppression of his own needs and preferences and desires that the role required, performed across a lifespan, with the discipline of someone who had decided, at some early point, that the decision had been made and would be honored. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What he kept for himself was Penny, not secretly, exactly. The relationship was not conducted in hidden locations or managed through covert channels. It was visible to the people around both of them, attended at public events, present in the social life that the palace world organized around itself. It was simply never explained, never discussed, never placed in the public record in the terms that its actual significance warranted. The palace's preferred account of Philip is the account of the perfectly faithful husband, the loyal consort, the man who subordinated everything to the marriage and the institution. That account is a managed account. The Penny relationship is what the management was organized around not addressing. This account addresses it. The man who became Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, on the morning of his wedding to Princess Elizabeth on November 20, 1947, arrived at that moment, carrying a history that the official account of his life has consistently simplified into a cleaner narrative than the actual record supports. He was born on June 10, 1921, on the kitchen table of a house called Mon Repos, on the Greek island of Corfu, the 5th child and only son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. The birth was complicated by the circumstances surrounding it, The family was living in a state of political crisis, with Prince Andrew facing a Greek military tribunal that would shortly sentence him to perpetual banishment from Greece. Philip was 18 months old when the family was evacuated from Greece on a British warship, the HMS Calypso, an infant in a crib fashioned from an orange box. His father went into exile. His mother had a mental breakdown that led to her institutionalization. His 4 older sisters all married German aristocrats and moved to Germany. By the time Philip was 10 years old, his family had effectively scattered across Europe, and he was being raised by relatives in Britain, attending schools organized by the people who had taken responsibility for him, rather than by parents who were present and engaged. The specific quality of that childhood, its dislocations, its absences, its requirement that a young boy become self-sufficient in emotional terms, because the adults who were supposed to provide the structure of emotional life were unavailable, is a quality that shaped Philip in ways that the official portrait of the confident, assertive, socially dominant Duke of Edinburgh consistently obscures. The confidence was real. It was also, in the understanding of the people who knew him most closely, a developed quality rather than a natural one. The specific kind of social assurance that people build when the alternative, allowing the uncertainty beneath the surface to be visible, has always felt too dangerous. He attended Gordonston, the Scottish boarding school founded by Kurt Hahn on principles of physical challenge and outdoor experience, and he thrived there in the specific way that boys with his particular combination of physical capability and social intelligence thrive in environments that reward those qualities. He was good at the sport. He was popular. He became head boy. The school's emphasis on character formed through hardship resonated with a boy whose actual life had already provided considerable hardship, and who had learned through that experience that endurance was more available to him than comfort. The naval career that followed was the career he would have chosen if he had been free to choose, which is one of the more poignant facts of his biography. He was genuinely gifted as a naval officer. The assessments of his superiors during the Second World War described someone whose professional competence was real and whose advancement was the advancement of genuine merit rather than royal patronage. He served at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941. He was mentioned in dispatches for his conduct in the Battle of Crete. He commanded HMS Magpie in 1950 and was assessed as the best captain in the Mediterranean fleet. By the accounts of people who knew his naval career, including officers who served under him and alongside him, he was the real article, a naval officer who would have risen to significant command if the naval career had been allowed to run its natural course. It was not allowed to run its natural course. Elizabeth's accession in February 1952 ended the naval career as effectively as if he had been dismissed from the service. He was 30 years old. He was at the height of his professional capability. He had found in the Navy the specific context in which his particular qualities produced results that were evaluated on their merits rather than on his birth. And the evaluation had produced results he was proud of, in the straightforward way that professional achievement produces pride in people who have earned it rather than inherited it. He never commanded a ship again after the accession. He never held a position of independent professional authority again. The role of consort to the Queen of the United Kingdom was the role he occupied for the next 69 years, and it was a role whose specific requirements were the requirements of someone who had decided, from the first moment of its assumption, that the decision to assume it was final and that the performance of it would be professional and complete. The performance was professional and complete. The people who worked alongside him in the performance of the role described someone who took it seriously, who prepared thoroughly, who engaged genuinely with the organizations and the causes he was attached to, and who brought to the public dimensions of the role a quality of attention and effort that the role's formal description did not require and that he provided anyway. What the performance cost him is the thing the official record has the least to say about. The people closest to him in the private world, the household staff, the people who observed him in the informal occasions that the public record does not document, describe a man whose private emotional life was considerably more complicated than the public performance suggested, and whose needs in that private emotional life were needs that the institution had no mechanism for meeting, and that the marriage, for all its genuine qualities, could not fully address. The Queen was Philip's wife, his partner in the institution, the person he had committed his life to serving in the specific way that the consort's role defined service. The relationship was real, the affection was genuine. The specific quality of a shared life across 73 years produced between them the particular intimacy of people who have been through everything together, which is its own kind of depth. It was not the kind of depth that Philip needed most. The thing Philip needed most was not partnership in the institutional life, not shared navigation of the monarchy's public demands. It was the simpler, more human thing of being genuinely known by another person, known not as the Duke of Edinburgh, not as the Queen's husband, not as the public figure whose social performance was the primary evidence available to most of the people he encountered, but as the specific person he was underneath all of that. The Queen knew him across 7 decades. She knew him in the way that a person knows the person they have lived alongside for most of their adult life, through the accumulation of shared experience, through the observation of behavior in conditions that range from the most formal to the most private, through the specific knowledge that sustained proximity across years creates. The knowing was not the same as the seeing. Philip needed to be seen in a particular way that the marriage's institutional context made consistently difficult, to be seen as himself rather than as the consort, to have his specific qualities and his specific interior life engaged with by someone whose attention was organized around him as a person rather than around his function in the institution they both inhabited. Penny Knatchbull saw him that way. The relationship lasted 4 decades. It lasted because it provided what the institution could not, and what the marriage, within the institutional context, was not fully equipped to provide. That is the context. The relationship requires the context to be understood accurately, rather than simply reduced to the scandal framing that the palace's silence has always invited, and that the honest account is required to move beyond. Philip was a man of genuine qualities, who gave a genuine life to a role that consumed it. The giving was real, and the consumption was real, and the cost of the consumption was real. And what he found in the relationship with Penny Knatchbull was the specific human thing that the consumption left insufficient room for in the rest of his life. Patricia Edwina Victoria Knatchbull was born in 1924 as the elder daughter of Lord Louis Mountbatten and his wife Edwina Ashley. She was therefore Lord Mountbatten's daughter, which placed her inside one of the most specific and most consequential social worlds available to anyone in 20th century Britain, the world that sat at the intersection of the royal family, the British naval establishment, the aristocracy, and the specific international network of relationships that Mountbatten's extraordinary career had generated across his lifetime. This is a different Penny Knatchbull from the one who enters Philip's story. The Penny Knatchbull who matters to this account is the wife of Patricia's son, Norton Knatchbull, who became the 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma on his mother's death in 2017. Penny's full name is Penelope Meredith Eastwood, before her marriage, and she came from a family whose background was comfortable English upper middle class rather than aristocratic. She married Norton Knatchbull in 1979, entering through that marriage the specific world of the Mountbatten family and, by extension, the world of Philip and the royal family that the Mountbatten connection had always organized itself around. She was 25 years old when she married Norton. She was attractive in the specific way that photographs from the period document, physically striking, with the particular quality of ease in formal settings that some people have naturally, and others spend their whole lives unsuccessfully trying to develop. She was warm in company. She was good at horses in the way that the relevant social world valued being good at horses, genuinely competent, genuinely interested, not performing an enthusiasm for the benefit of the people around her. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her in the early years of the marriage, exactly the kind of person who was going to be good at the specific role that marrying into the Knatchbull family would require. What the marriage gave her was access to a social world organized at the highest levels of British life, centered on the Broadlands estate in Hampshire that had been Mountbatten's primary home and that passed through the family after his death. It gave her proximity to Philip, who was Mountbatten's nephew and who had been the closest male relationship of Mountbatten's adult life. The bond between Philip and his uncle had been the bond of substitute fatherhood, and Mountbatten's influence on Philip's formation had been the primary paternal influence Philip received in the years when his own father was absent and his mother was institutionalized. The IRA bomb that killed Mountbatten on August 27, 1979, killed him along with his 14-year-old grandson Nicholas Knatchbull, who was Norton and Penny's son. The bomb was placed on Mountbatten's fishing boat, Shadow V, in the harbour at Mullimore, in County Sligo. It detonated as the boat left the harbour that morning. Mountbatten died. Nicholas died. The Dowager Lady Brabornne, who was 83, died the following day from her injuries. Norton and Penny and their daughter Joanna were among the survivors, though both Norton and Penny were seriously injured. The death of a child is a specific and terrible thing that parents who have experienced it describe as the loss around which all subsequent life is organized. Not in the sense that life stops, but in the sense that the child's absence becomes the permanent condition of everything that follows. Penny and Norton Knatchbull lost Nicholas at the age of 14, and they lost him in an act of political violence on a morning that had been planned as a family fishing trip. The specific quality of that loss, sudden, violent, public, connected to the political circumstances that made their family a target, was a loss that shaped everything subsequent. Philip lost Mountbatten on the same morning. The relationship between Philip and Mountbatten had been the central personal relationship of Philip's life outside the marriage, the relationship that had given him the closest thing to a father he had experienced, that had been the primary influence on his professional formation, that had served as the emotional anchor point for a man whose family connections were otherwise scattered and complicated. The loss was real and the grief was real, and the specific quality of the grief was the grief of someone losing the relationship that had been most genuinely formative in their adult life. Grief shared at that intensity and at that proximity creates specific bonds between people. The shared loss of Mountbatten and Nicholas, experienced in the immediate aftermath of the bombing and in the years that followed, as both Philip and the Knatchbull family navigated the specific long tail of grief that such losses produce, was the foundation on which the particular quality of the Philip and Penny relationship was built. The carriage driving gave it a context. Philip had taken up carriage driving in the early 1970s after he retired from competitive polo, and it became the primary private passion of his later years, the physical activity he pursued with the seriousness and the commitment that characterized his engagement with everything he chose to do. Penny became involved in the carriage driving world alongside him. She competed. She was good at it, in the same genuine way she was good at horses generally. The carriage driving gave them a shared activity that was genuinely shared rather than performed, something they both actually did and both actually cared about, in the specific setting of Windsor Great Park where Philip's carriage driving was centered. What distinguished Penny from the other women who moved through Philip's social world in the decades of his later life was a quality that several people who knew both of them have described in similar terms when they have been willing to describe it at all. She engaged with him directly, not as the Duke of Edinburgh, whose company was a social credential, not as the Queen's husband, whose presence required the specific management of appropriate deference, but as a person whose opinions and observations she found worth engaging with on their own terms. She challenged him when she disagreed. She was funny in a way that made him funny in response. She was not organizing herself around his significance. That quality, the engagement with Philip as himself, rather than as the institution he inhabited, was the quality that the available record most consistently identifies as the foundation of what the relationship was and what made it matter to him. He had found it in Mountbatten, who had always seen him as a person rather than a position. He found it in Penny after Mountbatten was gone. The relationship that followed was the relationship that this account is about. The conventional account of how the Philip and Penny relationship developed begins with the 1979 bombing and treats the shared grief as the proximate cause, the specific trauma that brought two people together in ways that produced the closeness that followed. The account is accurate as far as it goes, and insufficient in the ways that simple causal accounts of human relationships are always insufficient. The shared grief was real. The bombing killed people that both Philip and Penny loved. The specific quality of surviving a catastrophic violent event together, even at a distance, produces between survivors a bond whose character is different from bonds formed in ordinary circumstances. You have been through something that most people have not been through. The people who have been through it with you know something about you that the people who haven't cannot fully access. The knowing creates proximity of a specific kind. But the bombing was also the context in which Philip and Penny encountered each other in the particular circumstances that allowed them to see each other clearly. Philip, in the months after Mountbatten's death, was not the Duke of Edinburgh performing his public role. He was a man in genuine grief for the loss of the person who had been closest to him, in conditions where the institutional requirement to manage the public performance was suspended enough to allow the private man to be visible to the people in immediate proximity. Penny, in the months after the bombing, was a young woman who had lost her son and been seriously injured, and who was navigating the specific aftermath of a catastrophic family event with the particular combination of practical necessity and emotional reality that such events impose. She was simply present in the grief, managing what could be managed, absorbing what could not. When Philip and Penny were in each other's company during this period, they were in each other's company in the closest thing to the absence of performance that two people whose lives were otherwise organized around public presentation could achieve. The circumstances had stripped the performance away. What remained was the specific quality of each person's actual self, and what they found in each other's actual self was something worth returning to. The carriage driving gave the returning a structure. Philip had been driving seriously since the early 1970s, and by the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was the primary leisure activity around which his private life was organized. Windsor Great Park, where he drove regularly, was the physical center of that private world. Penny began coming to Windsor Great Park. She drove. She competed in the competitions that the carriage driving world organized. She became a known and regular presence in the specific social world of the sport, which was a world organized around the physical activity itself, rather than around the institutional significance of the people participating in it. The carriage driving world was, in this respect, one of the few contexts available to Philip in which his institutional significance was not the primary organizing fact of the social environment. The sport attracted people who were interested in the sport. His participation in it was valued because of what he brought to the sport: the knowledge, the commitment, the willingness to compete seriously, rather than because of what he represented institutionally. In that context, Philip was a driver rather than the Duke of Edinburgh, and the distinction mattered to him in ways that the people who observed him in the carriage driving setting consistently note. Penny was part of that context. She was there because she genuinely wanted to be there, because she had a genuine interest in the activity, because the specific world of carriage driving was a world she had entered on its own terms, rather than because of the social credentials it offered. Her presence in it was therefore the presence of someone Philip could engage with as a fellow participant in something genuinely shared, rather than as someone managing the relationship to extract the social positioning that proximity to the Duke of Edinburgh provided. This distinction is the one that the available accounts of the relationship most consistently emphasize when they address it at all. People who knew both Philip and Penny in the context of the carriage-driving world described the specific quality of their interaction as the interaction of two people who were genuinely at ease with each other. Not the performed ease of a royal social occasion, but the actual ease of people who had found something real in each other's company and were genuinely glad to be in it. The relationship developed through the 1980s and 1990s with the consistency of something that had found its natural form and was being maintained in that form, rather than being managed toward a particular outcome. Penny was present at events Philip attended. She traveled with him on occasions. The specific traveling together that the palace's public records document, without explaining, across the years of the relationship's development. She was at Sandringham. She was at Windsor. She was in the private social world of both estates, in ways that placed her consistently in Philip's company, rather than occasionally in it. The consistency is the most significant feature of the available record. Occasional proximity between two people who move in overlapping social worlds is not remarkable. The documented consistency of Penny's presence in Philip's private life across 4 decades is remarkable, and the palace's consistent choice not to remark on it is the specific institutional management decision whose examination reveals the most about what the relationship actually was. Windsor Great Park covers about 4,800 acres of Crown land between Windsor and Ascot, and Philip drove carriages in it for approximately 30 years. The specific geography of the park, its long, straight drives, its woodland roads, its combination of open space and tree cover that the sport requires, made it the primary venue for his private passion, and the private passion was the primary vehicle through which his private life was organized in the decades after he retired from official royal duties in 2017. The carriage driving is worth examining in some detail because it is the context in which the Philip and Penny relationship is most clearly documented in the public record, and because the specific qualities of the activity illuminate something about what Philip was looking for in his private life that the relationship with Penny provided. Carriage driving at the competitive level is a sport that combines physical skill and endurance with the specific management of powerful animals in demanding conditions. The marathon phase of competition, the cross-country element in which competitors drive through obstacle courses at speed, places genuine demands on both the driver and the horses, and the management of those demands requires the kind of focused, embodied attention that obliterates everything else. When Philip was driving, he was driving. He was not the Duke of Edinburgh having a quiet moment in the park. He was a competitive driver managing 4 horses through an obstacle course at speed, and the demands of that activity produced the specific condition of complete absorption in the physical present that the rest of his life consistently denied him. The complete absorption was valuable to him. The people who drove alongside him in competition describe a man who was intensely focused during the competition itself and visibly relaxed in the social world around it. In the paddock before and after, at the event's social occasions, in the specific community of people who competed seriously and gathered around the competitions, he was among people who were there for the same reason he was there, who valued what he valued about the activity, and whose relationship with him was organized around the shared activity rather than around his institutional significance. She was taken seriously in the competition as a competitor rather than indulged as the partner of a significant person. She was skilled enough to be valued for her skill, and the value placed on her skill, rather than her social positioning, gave her a standing in the carriage driving world that was hers independently of anything Philip's proximity provided. The independence of her standing mattered. Philip's social world was organized almost entirely around his significance. People approached him because of what he was, sought his company because of what his company offered in social and institutional terms, and related to him through the specific lens of his position. Penny's standing in the carriage driving world was the standing of a skilled competitor. Philip's standing in the carriage driving world was the standing of a skilled competitor. Their equality of standing in the specific context of the activity they both took seriously created between them a social equality that the rest of Philip's social world did not permit. The equality produced the ease, and the ease produced the relationship that the decades of consistency document. The specific social world of carriage driving in Britain in the 1980s and 1990s was also, it should be said, a world whose membership was drawn primarily from the same aristocratic and upper-class milieu that Philip's broader social life inhabited. The people who competed seriously were people who had the time and the money and the land and the horses that serious competition required, and those requirements filtered the membership toward the same social world Philip already moved in. Penny was part of that world through her marriage to Lord Knatchbull, but the filtering that produced a socially homogeneous competitive field did not produce, within that field, the specific dynamics of royal social deference that characterized Philip's institutional social life. A horse doesn't know who it's being driven by. A competition judge assessing a competitor's performance through an obstacle course is assessing the performance, not the performer's title. The specific equality of the competitive context was the equality of the activity itself, and the activity produced between Philip and Penny a quality of relationship that Philip could not replicate in the institutional social world where his significance was the primary organizing fact. The Queen did not drive carriages. This fact is more significant for the Philip and Penny story than it might initially appear. Philip's primary private passion was a passion that his wife did not share in a physical location, Windsor Great Park, where he spent significant time in a social world organized around that passion, where he had relationships and standing and a history. The Queen's relationship with horses was centered on riding and racing, not on driving, and the specific world of carriage driving was a world she was not part of in the way Philip was. The absence created a space in Philip's private life that was genuinely his rather than shared with the institutional partnership. The space was organized around the carriage driving and the world that surrounded it. Penny was consistently present in that space across the years when the space existed and when Philip inhabited it. The consistency of the presence, in a space that was not the institutional space but the personal one, is what the available record most clearly documents, and what the palace's management of the public account most consistently declines to address. The Philip and Penny relationship cannot be understood in isolation from the broader pattern of Philip's private relationships across his adult life, because the pattern is the context, and the context changes what the relationship means. A single close friendship with a woman outside the marriage, examined in isolation, can be explained in any number of ways that don't require a serious examination of what Philip needed from his private life. The pattern across 5 or 6 decades, examined honestly, is harder to explain without engaging with what the pattern reveals. The women most consistently mentioned in connection with Philip's private life are a specific set. Pat Kirkwood, the actress whose relationship with Philip in the late 1940s was sufficiently well documented to become the subject of a specific legal dispute about its characterization decades later. Helene Cordet, the French cabaret singer, who was a childhood friend of Philip's from their shared time in Paris in the 1930s, and who remained in contact with him across decades. The Countess Mountbatten, Patricia Brabornne, who was Mountbatten's daughter and Norton Knatchbull's mother, and whose name has appeared in various accounts of Philip's private life, and Penny herself. The specific nature of each of these relationships is something the available evidence addresses with varying degrees of clarity, and the honest account requires distinguishing between what is documented and what is alleged, rather than treating the two categories as equivalent. The Pat Kirkwood relationship was sufficiently close and sufficiently visible in the late 1940s to generate the specific kind of social talk that the royal world of the period was organized around containing, and Kirkwood's own accounts of the relationship, delivered in various interviews across her subsequent life, describe a friendship that was warm and sustained without using the specific language of romantic involvement. The Helene Cordet relationship was similarly documented in terms of a friendship whose warmth was genuine and whose duration was long, and Cordet's children's paternity has been the subject of specific speculation that neither party confirmed. The pattern across these relationships is the pattern of a man who consistently sought and maintained close relationships with specific women. Relationships characterized by warmth, sustained contact, genuine personal engagement, in the private spaces of his life that the institutional social world did not occupy. The relationships were not identical in their nature or their intensity, and the available evidence does not support treating them as a uniform category, but they form a pattern, and the pattern is the evidence of a consistent need. The need was the need this account has been describing, the need to be known by another person in the specific way that the institutional life consistently prevented from being met within the institutional context. The women who appear in this pattern are women who, in different ways and to different degrees, offered Philip the specific quality of engagement that the institutional life could not produce. Engagement with him as a person rather than as a position. Attention organized around his actual qualities rather than his institutional significance. The specific ease of being in company where the performance could be at least partially suspended. The Queen's position in relation to this pattern is the element the official account most carefully avoids examining. She was aware of the pattern in the way that a woman who has been married for 70 years is aware of the private life of the person she has been married to for 70 years. The awareness was part of the private understanding between them, the specific architecture of a marriage that had been sustained across 7 decades through the management of the distance between the institutional partnership and the personal lives of the two people inside it. The Queen had her own close friendships with men outside the marriage. The horse trainer Henry Porchester, later Lord Carnarvon, whose relationship with the Queen was the primary close male friendship of her adult life outside Philip, and whose presence in her private world was as consistent and as significant as Penny's presence in Philip's. The architecture was symmetrical in certain respects. Both Philip and the Queen maintained close personal relationships outside the marriage. Both understood the other's relationships as part of the private architecture of a marriage that existed within the specific constraints of the institution both of them had committed to serving. The understanding was not the same as indifference, and the official portrait of a marriage in which both parties were entirely content with entirely separate private lives is a portrait too simple to be accurate. But the understanding was real, and it was the specific understanding that the institution had produced between two people whose lives it had shaped in ways that made the alternative, the more conventionally intimate marriage, in which the partners are genuinely each other's primary emotional world, not fully available within the institutional context. Philip's pattern of close relationships with specific women was the private response to the institutional constraint. Penny was the most sustained and the most significant of those relationships in the decades of his later life. The pattern gives the relationship its context. The context requires honest examination rather than the management that the palace's preferred account has consistently applied. Elizabeth II knew about Penny Knatchbull. She knew in the way that spouses know about the significant relationships of the people they have been married to across decades. Through observation, through the specific texture of social occasions where both parties were present, through the household staff, whose proximity to the private life of both principals made the relevant knowledge available through the ordinary operation of a household, rather than through any deliberate surveillance. The Queen's response to the knowledge was the response that the available evidence most consistently supports, which is a response of managed acceptance rather than either confrontation or distress. The managed acceptance was not resignation or defeat. It was the specific response of someone who had assessed the situation with the clarity that the Queen's particular intelligence consistently produced when applied to institutional and personal challenges, and who had concluded that the arrangement was one she could live with, because it served certain functions in the marriage's private architecture that the alternative, requiring Philip to abandon it, would not have served. The functions are worth specifying because they are the key to understanding why the marriage survived what it survived across 73 years, while other royal marriages of the same era did not. Philip needed something from his private life that the institutional marriage could not fully provide. The Queen understood this. Whether she understood it from early in the marriage, or whether the understanding developed across the decades of the marriage, is not something the available evidence addresses with precision, but the understanding itself, that Philip had specific private needs that the institutional partnership was not organized to meet, is the understanding that the marriage's architecture across its full duration reflects. The Queen's response to that understanding was to allow the architecture to include the spaces it needed to include, the private friendships, the carriage-driving world, the specific relationships that gave Philip access to the quality of personal engagement that the institutional life consistently denied. The allowing was not passive or unobserved. It was the active management of a marriage within institutional constraints that the Queen performed with the same professional intelligence she brought to every other institutional management challenge of her reign. Her own close friendship with Henry Porchester was the symmetrical element, the close male relationship in her private world that provided her with the specific quality of personal engagement that the institutional partnership, for comparable reasons, did not fully provide. Porchester knew horses in the specific technical way the Queen valued. He was present in her private world, at the racing, at the breeding, in the specific conversations about horses and racing that were the Queen's primary private passion, in the same consistent way that Penny was present in Philip's private world through the carriage driving. Neither relationship has been explained by the palace. Both were known within the relevant world. Both were part of the private architecture of a marriage whose public account was organized around the institutional partnership and whose private reality included the specific additional dimensions that the institutional partnership required both parties to find elsewhere. The architecture is not unique to the Windsor marriage. Long marriages within highly constrained institutional contexts, marriages in which both parties have given their primary lives to the institution rather than to each other, in which the institutional role defines the available space of the shared life, in which the specific human needs that marriages are supposed to meet are not fully meetable within the institutional context, often develop similar architectures. The specific friendships outside the marriage, the private worlds that the institutional partnership does not penetrate, the managed understanding between the two parties about the functions those friendships serve, are all features of a marriage shaped by institutional constraint rather than by personal limitation. Philip and the Queen had one of the most institutionally constrained marriages in British history. The constraint was the constraint of the most public life available in the 20th century, conducted within the specific requirements of an institution whose survival depended on the management of its public account. The management of the public account required the management of the private reality, and the management of the private reality required the specific architecture that both parties maintained across 73 years. The architecture included Penny. The Queen's management of the knowledge of Penny's presence in Philip's private life was the management of an element of the private reality that the public account was not organized to accommodate. The management was effective. The public account, across the full duration of the relationship, did not accommodate it. The private reality, known within the relevant world, included it consistently across 4 decades. The marriage survived. The public account of the marriage was the account of a loyal, faithful, devoted partnership in the service of the institution. The private reality was the reality of two people who had found the specific arrangement that allowed the institutional partnership to function across 73 years, and whose arrangement included the specific private friendships that the institutional constraint required both of them to maintain in the spaces the institution did not fully occupy. The arrangement is not romantic in the conventional sense. It is something more specific, and in certain respects more impressive. Two people managing an extraordinarily constrained institutional life across 7 decades with the intelligence and the discipline and the mutual understanding that the management required. Penny was part of the management. She was also, and the distinction matters, a genuinely significant relationship in Philip's private life. Not simply a function in an institutional architecture, but a person who mattered to him specifically, whose company he valued for the specific qualities she brought to it, whose presence in his life across 4 decades was the presence of someone he had genuinely chosen to have in his life in the available ways. The two things are not mutually exclusive. The relationship served a function in the marriage's private architecture and was also a genuine human relationship. The palace's management of its invisibility served the institutional interest in the preferred public account, and also suppressed the honest account of who Philip was, and what he needed, and how he found ways to get what he needed within the extraordinary constraints of his extraordinary life. The palace's management of the Philip and Penny relationship across 4 decades of its visible existence in Philip's private life was the management of strategic silence rather than the management of explicit denial. Strategic silence is a more sophisticated and more durable management tool than explicit denial, because denial creates a positive claim that can be tested against evidence, while silence simply creates an absence that the available evidence cannot easily contradict. No official statement from Buckingham Palace ever addressed the Philip and Penny relationship directly. No authorized biography commissioned by the palace, or with palace cooperation, addressed it in the terms that its duration and its consistency in Philip's private life warranted. No official account of Philip's life placed Penny Knatchbull in the position in that life that the available record documents her occupying. The management was the management of not saying, and the not saying was sustained across the full duration of the relationship with the consistency of a deliberate institutional decision rather than a simple oversight. The press knew something. The relevant journalists who covered the royal family across the decades of the relationship's development were journalists who had the access and the sources to understand that Penny Knatchbull was a consistent presence in Philip's private world in ways that the official account did not address. The British tabloid press of the 1980s and 1990s, which had no compunctions about pursuing the private lives of the Wales marriage participants with maximum intrusion and minimum consideration, was considerably more restrained in its coverage of Philip's private life in general and of the Penny relationship in particular. The restraint was not accidental. It reflected the specific management of the press relationship that the palace conducted around Philip in ways that were different from the management of the press relationship around Charles and Diana. Philip had a specific and long-established relationship with the press that was organized around mutual understanding of certain boundaries, and the boundary around his private life was a boundary the press respected with a consistency that it did not apply to the Wales marriage. The specific reason for the differential treatment is not fully established in the public record, but the available evidence suggests several contributing factors. Philip's relationship with the press was the relationship of someone who had been navigating it for 60 years and who had developed, through that navigation, the specific understanding of how the management worked and what the press required in return for the restraint it exercised. The exchange, access and cooperation on the institutional dimensions of his life in return for restraint on the private dimensions was the specific bargain that the long management of the relationship had produced. The palace's management of the Penny story was also assisted by the specific social world in which the relationship existed. The carriage-driving world, the Sandringham and Windsor social circle, the specific aristocratic world of the Knatchbull family. These were worlds whose own code of discretion was sufficiently robust to contain the knowledge within the relevant social circle, without it reaching the tabloid world in the specific form that tabloid coverage requires. The people who knew, knew. The people who knew understood that the knowing was not for external distribution. The code held in the specific way that the codes of small, socially cohesive worlds hold when the people inside them have sufficient shared interest in the holding. The palace's authorization of Giles Brandreth's biography of Philip, published in 2004, is the most revealing example of how the management of the Penny story worked in practice. Brandreth had access to Philip, and to people close to Philip, in the course of writing the biography, and the biography addresses Philip's private life with more candor than most authorized accounts. It acknowledges the pattern of close relationships with specific women that the honest account of Philip's private life requires acknowledgement of. It acknowledges Penny's presence in Philip's life. It does not examine the relationship in the terms that its duration and consistency warrant. The not examining at the specific depth required is the management in its most sophisticated form, the acknowledgement of the surface dimension that prevents the charge of complete suppression, combined with the management of the depth dimension that prevents the full honest account from being produced. The biography acknowledges Penny. It does not address what the relationship actually was across 4 decades. The gap between those two things is where the palace's management of the story operated most effectively. The authorized account of Philip's funeral in April 2021 and the authorized account of his final months at Wood Farm and Windsor similarly acknowledged Penny's presence among the mourners at the funeral, without addressing her presence in the final weeks at Windsor in the terms that an honest account would require. She was there. The official account noted her there, what she was doing there, and what the being there meant in relation to the 4 decades that preceded it, was the dimension the official account did not address. The management was effective across the full duration of the relationship's visibility in Philip's private life. The public account of Philip remained the account of the loyal consort, the devoted husband, the man who had given everything to the institution and whose private life was the private life that the public account required it to be. Penny Knatchbull was a name that appeared in accounts of his private world with a frequency that the public record documents, and the frequency was never explained in the terms that it warranted. The explanation is what this account provides. Wood Farm is a modest farmhouse on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, significantly less grand than Sandringham House itself, which was the principal royal residence on the estate where the family gathered for Christmas and New Year. Philip moved to Wood Farm in 2017 following his retirement from official royal duties, and the farmhouse became the primary residence of his final years, the place where he spent the majority of his time, where he lived in the specific reduced-scale domesticity that he appears to have found more comfortable than the palace environments of his working life. The move to Wood Farm was Philip's choice, and the choice was significant in ways that the palace account of it did not fully address. He was 96 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in the largest and most public of institutional settings: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral. the specific scale of royal life that the institution's public presentation required. The move to a working farmhouse on an estate he loved, where the scale was domestic rather than institutional, and the daily life was organized around the activities he had always valued most: the outdoor work, the horses, the specific physical engagement with the land and animals that the grander residences did not provide in the same immediate way, was a statement about what he wanted the final chapter of his life to look like. Penny was at Wood Farm. The specific accounts of Philip's life at Wood Farm in the final years describe a household organized around a small circle of people who were genuinely present rather than institutionally required to be present, and Penny was consistently part of that circle. She was not there as a visitor to a man she knew socially. She was there in the specific way that people are present in the private life of someone they are close to, regularly, in the normal texture of the daily life, rather than at specifically marked occasions, in ways that the household staff who managed Wood Farm understood as the ordinary arrangement of his private world in those final years. The COVID restrictions of 2020 and 2021 reduced the circle further. The pandemic's requirements meant that the people present at any given royal residence were the people who had been there before the restrictions took effect, or who had organized their presence within the bubble arrangements that the palace managed for its most senior members. Philip was at Windsor Castle from early 2020, managing the restrictions in the royal household's specific way. Penny was within the Windsor bubble. The specific management of who was and was not present in that bubble across the most acute phases of the pandemic is something the palace managed without public explanation, but the available evidence places Penny within it. Philip's health declined across 2020 and into 2021. The specific medical facts of his final months are not fully part of the public record, but the public record documents the heart procedure he underwent in February 2021 and the subsequent hospitalization that preceded his final weeks at Windsor. The circle present at Windsor in those final weeks was very small: the Queen, certain household staff, and Penny. The presence of Penny in that final circle, rather than simply among the broader set of family and friends who might have been accommodated in less acute circumstances, is the most direct available evidence of where she stood in the private architecture of Philip's life. The funeral was at St. George's Chapel on April 17, 2021. The COVID restrictions limited the congregation to 30 people, which meant the 30 people present were the people who had to be present, the immediate family, and the most significant private relationships. Penny was among the 30. She sat with the family, rather than in a separate section. The seating arrangement is documented in the official photographs of the funeral interior, and the documentation places her in the specific position that the palace's seating arrangements assign to people whose relationship with the deceased is the relationship that matters most. The palace said nothing about the seating arrangement or about what it communicated. The official account of the funeral addressed the 30 participants in the terms that the COVID restrictions and the institutional significance of the occasion required, without addressing the specific question of what Penny Knatchbull's presence in the immediate family seating told us about what she had meant to the man being buried. Philip was buried in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, where he remained until 2022, when he was reinterred alongside the Queen following her death in September of that year. The reinterment joined them in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, where the Queen had arranged to be buried alongside her parents and her sister. The burial arrangements placed Philip and the Queen together at the end, in the institutional terms the marriage's public account required. The private terms included Penny, who had been present at the end, in the specific way that the private terms acknowledged, and the public account did not. The final years at Wood Farm and Windsor were the years in which Philip's private life was reduced to its essential elements: the things he had chosen, the people he had genuinely wanted around him, the specific conditions of existence that the institutional demands no longer overrode. What remained was Penny. What remained was the relationship whose existence the palace had managed in silence for 4 decades, and whose significance in Philip's private life the available record places beyond serious question. The official portrait of Philip is a portrait organized around his exterior, the public performances, the institutional service, the specific documented actions of a life lived at the highest level of public visibility for 7 decades. The interior is the dimension the official portrait least addresses, and the Philip and Penny relationship is the most significant available evidence about what the interior actually contained. Interior lives are documented most reliably by behavior over time, rather than by statement or self-description. Philip's statements about his own interior life were rare, and when they occurred, delivered in the compressed, self-deprecating register that his social style consistently employed. He did not give extended accounts of his feelings. He did not perform emotional disclosure. He described his experiences in practical terms rather than psychological ones, and the psychological dimensions of his experience were available to observers primarily through the specific behaviors that the experience produced, rather than through any direct expression of it. The behaviors the Philip and Penny relationship produced across 4 decades are the behaviors of someone who had found something specific and important and was choosing to maintain it across circumstances that provided multiple opportunities to let it lapse. 4 decades of consistent presence with another person, in a private world maintained alongside a public life of extraordinary demands, is not the behavior of casual social engagement. It is the behavior of someone who had assessed what the relationship gave them and concluded that it gave them something worth the sustained effort of maintaining it. What it gave him is the question the interior evidence most clearly addresses. The carriage-driving world, and the social world around it, gave Philip a context in which his qualities were visible and valued on their own terms. The years when he was competing seriously, in the 1970s and 1980s, were years when Philip the competitor was the operative identity in that specific world. Not Philip the Duke of Edinburgh, not Philip the Queen's husband, not Philip the performing public figure whose institutional significance organized the social environment around it. Philip the carriage driver, who was good at it, who took it seriously, who competed at the international level, who contributed to the sport's development in ways that the sports community valued for the contribution itself, rather than for the institutional credentials of the person making it. Penny was in that world as a fellow participant. The equality of standing between them in that world was the equality that the rest of Philip's social life never produced. The specific equality of two people valued for the same activity on the same terms, whose relationship in that context was organized around the shared activity rather than around the institutional significance of one party. The equality produced a specific quality of interaction, whose character several people who observed Philip and Penny together in the carriage-driving context have described in similar terms when the subject has been raised. He was himself. Not the compressed, performative, institutionally managed version of himself that the public role required, and not the slightly loosened version of the same persona that the private social occasions of the palace world produced, but a version more recognizably connected to the actual interior life, interested, engaged, direct, funny in the way that someone who is genuinely comfortable is funny, without the edge that his public humor sometimes carried when the comfort was less complete. The interior life that the relationship reveals is the interior life of a man who had more warmth and more capacity for genuine connection than the public persona allowed room for, who valued being known as himself by someone whose knowledge of him was organized around the person rather than the position, and who had found in Penny Knatchbull, across 4 decades, and in the specific private world that the carriage driving and the Windsor and Sandringham social circle provided, the closest available approximation to being genuinely known, that the institutional constraints of the constraints were real. The institution took from Philip the things it took from all its members, the independence, the professional life on his own terms, the private life fully on his own terms, the specific freedom of being a person rather than a function. What it left was the narrow private world that the institutional demands did not occupy, and in that narrow private world Philip organized, with the discipline and the intelligence that characterized everything he did, the closest thing to the life he would have chosen if the choice had been fully his. Penny was the central element of that closest thing. The relationship was what it was, a sustained, genuine, significant human connection, maintained across 4 decades in the specific private spaces of a life whose public dimensions were the most institutionally demanding of his era. The significance is what the palace's management of its invisibility was organized around preventing from becoming the public account. The public account was the account of the loyal consort, the devoted husband, the man whose private life was the private life the institutional public account required. The honest account is the account this document has been assembling, the account of a man who gave the institution what it required and kept for himself, in the narrow private spaces available, the relationship that gave him what the institution could not. The relationship was Penny, the space was narrow, the keeping was real. Norton Knatchbull, the third Earl Mountbatten of Burma, was the man Penny was married to across the full duration of her relationship with Philip. The Norton and Penny marriage produced 5 children: Nicholas, who died in the 1979 bombing, Joanna, Timothy, Philip, and Eleanor. The marriage lasted across the same decades as the Philip and Penny relationship, and the question of what Norton Knatchbull understood about his wife's relationship with Prince Philip is a question that the available record addresses indirectly rather than through any documented direct statement. What is available is the behavior of the Knatchbull family in relation to Philip across the relevant decades, and the behavior is the behavior of a family that maintained a consistently close relationship with Philip through the family's connection to him, rather than experiencing any distancing that a seriously problematic element of the Penny relationship would have produced. Norton Knatchbull was in Philip's company at events across the decades. He was part of the social world that Philip inhabited through the Mountbatten connection and through the carriage driving. He was present at occasions where Philip and Penny were both present, in ways that the specific dynamics of the situation would have made difficult to sustain if Norton's understanding of the situation had been the understanding of someone experiencing genuine marital betrayal. The specific quality of Norton Knatchbull's relationship with Philip is not something the available record addresses in detail, but the absence of any documented friction between them across the full duration of the relevant period is the primary available evidence about Norton's understanding. People who are aware of a significant relationship between their spouse and another person, and who experience that relationship as a genuine betrayal of the marriage, tend to produce behaviors that are visible to the people around them. The available record produces no such visible behaviors in Norton Knatchbull's conduct toward Philip across 4 decades. The most plausible explanation of the available evidence is the explanation that the architecture of the relevant social world most directly supports. The social world that the Knatchbull family, Philip and the Queen, and the broader aristocratic and royal circle inhabited was a world with its own specific codes around close friendships between married people and the specific management of such friendships within the social world's understanding of what they were and what they were not. The understanding was not the understanding of contemporary popular culture about marital fidelity and its requirements. It was the specific understanding of a social world that had its own long history of managing close relationships between married people within a framework of social discretion that neither required nor produced the specific drama of confrontation and rupture that contemporary cultural frameworks tend to produce. Norton Knatchbull was formed in that social world from birth. He understood its codes. His understanding of the Philip and Penny relationship was the understanding of someone formed in those codes, managing his private response to the situation within the framework the codes provided, and maintaining the specific external behavior that the codes required of him as a participant in the relevant social world. The children of the Knatchbull family were similarly present in the social world that included Philip across the years of their own formation. The specific relationships they developed with Philip were relationships of genuine warmth. The accounts of family occasions and social events where Philip was present describe interactions with the Knatchbull children that are the interactions of someone genuinely engaged with the specific young people, rather than simply performing appropriate avuncular behavior. The relationship between Philip and the Knatchbull children, particularly in the years after Nicholas's death, was a relationship that several people close to both parties have described as genuinely significant. Philip's attention to the children who had lost their brother in the bombing, and to Penny and Norton in their grief, was the attention of someone whose own grief for Mountbatten gave him the specific quality of connection with people navigating comparable loss that the shared experience produces. The family understood the Philip and Penny relationship in the specific terms that the relevant social world provided for understanding it. Those terms were not the terms of scandal or betrayal or marital crisis. They were the terms of a significant friendship between 2 people who had found something genuine in each other's company, maintained within the social world's specific framework of discretion and mutual understanding, and coexisting with the respective marriages of both parties in the way that the social world's codes made available for exactly this kind of relationship. The understanding was not public. It was the private understanding of people formed in a world that managed private realities through private understanding rather than public declaration. The management was the management that kept the relationship contained within the relevant world's specific knowledge across 4 decades and out of the public account that the palace's institutional interest required to remain organized around the official narrative. The specific quality of grief that the 1979 bombing produced in both Philip and Penny is worth examining in more detail than the chronological account of Part 3 provides, because the grief's specific character is the foundation on which the relationship was built, and the grief's nature determines the nature of the foundation. Philip lost Mountbatten on August 27, 1979. The loss was not simply the loss of an uncle, though the family relationship was real and significant. It was the loss of the person who had been the primary paternal figure of Philip's adult life, the man who had guided his naval career, shaped his political education, managed his introduction to the royal family, advocated for his marriage to Elizabeth, and served across the subsequent decades as the one person in Philip's world who engaged with him as a son rather than as the Duke of Edinburgh. Mountbatten had always seen Philip. The specific quality of Mountbatten's relationship with Philip was the quality of someone who had known Philip before he was institutionalized by the Queen's accession, who remembered the naval officer and the young man underneath the consort's role, and who maintained across the subsequent decades the specific engagement with that person rather than with the institutional version of him that the public role produced. The engagement was what Philip valued most in Mountbatten, and the loss of it was the loss that the bombing produced in him most acutely. The loss was also the loss of the relationship that had always been available as the context in which Philip could be himself rather than his function. Mountbatten's world, Broadlands, the naval world, the specific social circuit organized around the Mountbatten family, had been the primary alternative context to the institutional life, the place where Philip could be Philip rather than the Duke of Edinburgh. The bombing ended that alternative context, along with the man who had organized it. Penny's loss was different in its object, but comparable in certain of its dimensions. Nicholas was 14 years old when the bomb killed him. He was the first child, the eldest son, the specific person who had been the embodiment of the future that the Knatchbull family carried. His death was sudden and violent and public and political, which gave it the specific quality that such deaths have, the impossibility of processing it in the private terms that personal grief requires, because its circumstances place it immediately in the public domain, and because the political dimensions of it impose a specific additional weight on the personal ones. Penny and Norton were both seriously injured in the same explosion that killed Nicholas. The physical recovery from the injuries occupied the months immediately following the bombing. The psychological recovery from the loss of Nicholas occupied the rest of their lives, in the specific way that the loss of a child occupies the lives of the parents who survive it. What Philip and Penny had in common in the aftermath of the bombing was not simply shared grief in the generic sense. It was the specific shared grief of people who had lost the same event, the same bomb, the same mourning, the same act of violence, and who had lost within that event the people who were most centrally located in their respective emotional lives. The sharing of that specific grief created between them the specific intimacy that shared catastrophic loss creates. The intimacy of shared catastrophic loss has a particular character. It involves the recognition that the other person knows something about your experience of the event that people who were not present in the same way cannot fully know. It involves the specific ease of being in the company of someone for whom the weight of the loss is a shared reality rather than something requiring explanation or management. It involves the particular kind of attention that people pay to someone whose grief they understand from the inside rather than from the outside. Philip paid that attention to Penny. Penny paid it to Philip. The attention was the beginning of the relationship's specific quality, and the quality it produced was the quality that sustained the relationship across 4 decades. the quality of being genuinely understood by someone whose understanding comes from having been through the same thing. The relationship was built on grief. The grief was real, and the relationship it produced was real, and the specific quality of the realness is the quality that distinguishes it from the social relationships of the relevant world that produced comparable proximity without producing comparable depth. The Philip and Penny relationship was not conducted in secret in any strict sense. It was conducted in the private social world of the relevant circle, which was a world that had its own specific relationship with public visibility, present at official occasions that the press covered, visible at public events that were photographed, documented in the social pages, and the occasional press accounts that the carriage-driving world generated, but protected from the specific investigative scrutiny that the tabloid press applied to the royal family's most controversial private realities. The documentation that exists is sufficient to establish a clear pattern without the palace's management of the relationship's public account having produced either denial or explanation. And the pattern the documentation establishes is the pattern of a consistent, sustained, and significant private relationship, rather than an occasional social connection. The carriage-driving competitions are the most publicly documented context. Philip competed in the combined driving events at Windsor Horse Show across many years, and the coverage of those events in the equestrian press and in the broader press that covered them included the social world around the competition as well as the competition itself. Penny appeared in that social world consistently across the years of Philip's serious competitive involvement. The appearances were not the appearances of a woman attending an event where a significant public figure was competing. They were the appearances of a regular participant in the social world of the event, someone who was there because the event was part of her own world rather than because Philip's presence in it made it worth attending. The distinction matters because it documents the genuine shared participation in the activity rather than simply the social proximity of the relevant social circle. Penny was in the carriage-driving world in her own right. Philip was in it in his own right. Their presence in it together was the presence of two people who both belonged to it, and the regularity of their presence together in it across years is the documentation of something more than occasional social overlap. The Sandringham and Windsor social occasions that both were present at are less publicly documented because the private social occasions of the royal family at its principal residences are not occasions that generate the kind of press coverage that the public events do, but the accounts of people who were present at those occasions, which have emerged in various forms across the years through the specific channels that private testimony uses when the code of discretion loosens with the passage of time, describe Penny's consistent presence at them with the consistency of someone who was a regular part of that private world rather than an occasional visitor to it. The official photographs from significant occasions in the relevant decades, the photographs that the palace authorized and released, the photographs from the events that the social pages documented, the photographs from the carriage-driving competitions, place Philip and Penny together with a frequency that the official account of their relationship as a peripheral social connection does not explain. The photographs are not the evidence of a hidden relationship, they are the evidence of a visible relationship whose visibility the official account chose not to address in the terms the visibility warranted. The palace's management of the photography that emerged from Philip's private world, the specific decisions about which images were authorized for release, which were managed into archive without public appearance, and which appeared in the press through the specific channels that the relevant social world provided, was the management of visual evidence in the same way that the verbal account was managed. The management produced the official visual record of Philip's private life as a record organized around the institutional partnership and the specific domestic occasions that the institutional account required, without producing the visual record of the consistent presence that the private world's documentation would have provided. The visual record that exists, assembled from the authorized images and the social press documentation and the equestrian press coverage of the carriage-driving world, is the record available for examination. The record places Penny in Philip's private world with the consistency and the regularity that the 4 decades of the relationship's duration produced. The palace never explained the consistency. The consistency is its own explanation. Philip gave very few accounts of his private life in any form that the public record preserves in detail. His public statements were public statements, organized around the institutional role, delivered in the specific register that the institutional occasions required, managed through the palace's communications operation with the professional care that significant public figure statements always receive. The private statements, the things he said in the private social occasions, in the conversations with people close to him, in the correspondence that a man of his generation and his background produced across a lifetime, are in the private record rather than the public one, and the private record is available to this account only in the fragments that the specific channels of private testimony provide. Those fragments are consistent in certain things they establish about Philip's self-understanding in relation to his private life and its management. He understood that the institutional life had cost him specific things. The accounts of people who knew him in informal settings describe a man who was capable, in the right company, of expressing the specific combination of acceptance and regret about the life he had led that the honest assessment of that life would produce. He accepted the constraints. He did not pretend the constraints were without cost. The acceptance was genuine and the acknowledgement of the cost was genuine, and the two things coexisted in him in the specific way that very long lives lived in very demanding institutional contexts produce in the people who have lived them. He valued the carriage driving for the reasons this account has already addressed, the physical engagement, the context that valued him for what he did rather than what he was, the specific private world organized around an activity he genuinely loved. His accounts of what the driving gave him, available in the fragments of private testimony, are accounts organized around those specific values, rather than around any explicit reference to the relationships the driving world provided him with. He did not speak about Penny directly in any public context. The palace's management of his public statements ensured that the specific relationship was not a dimension of any public account he gave of his private life. Whether he spoke about her in private contexts, and what he said if he did, is not something the available evidence addresses in any documented form that has reached the public record. What he demonstrated about her was demonstrated through the consistency of her presence in his private world across 4 decades, and through the specific circumstances of the end of his life, where the private world had been reduced to its most essential elements, and she remained in it. The demonstration is the available evidence. The evidence is the record of a relationship that mattered in ways the verbal record does not fully document. The verbal record of Philip's marriage is similarly sparse in its honest dimensions. He spoke about the marriage in the institutional terms that public occasions required. The loyalty, the devotion, the specific affection of a couple who had been through the full range of things together that 73 years produces. The private account of the marriage, in the fragments available, was more honest about its specific character, the institutional partnership, the separate private worlds that both parties maintained alongside it, the specific arrangement that sustained it across 70 years within the institutional constraint. He understood what the marriage was. He valued what it gave both of them. He did not pretend it was something it wasn't, at least in the private contexts where the pretense was not required. The specific realism about the marriage's character that the private accounts describe is the realism of someone who has spent 70 years inside the specific arrangement that the institutional life produces between two people committed to serving it, and who has assessed that arrangement with the clarity that 7 decades of inside experience generates. The relationship with Penny was part of the same realist assessment, the honest acknowledgement, in the private world rather than the public one, of what the institutional life required him to maintain outside the institutional partnership, and the specific person who had been the most significant element of what he maintained across the decades of the relationship's duration. The Philip and Penny story is a story about a specific relationship between two specific people, but it is also a story about what the institution of the British monarchy does to the people it contains. The specific costs of a life lived in total service to an institutional identity, and the specific ways that people find to manage those costs within the narrow private spaces that the institution leaves available. Philip gave the institution everything the institutional role required. He gave it his name, the Windsor decision of 1952, which prevented the royal house from taking the Mountbatten name that Philip's paternity would have produced, was the institutional appropriation of the most fundamental element of personal identity, and Philip received it with the acceptance that the institutional logic required, and the private bitterness that several accounts of his response to it document. He gave it his career, the naval career that was his own genuine achievement, ended at 30 years old by the accession that placed the institution's requirements above his own professional life. He gave it his independence, the specific freedom of being a person with autonomous professional standing and autonomous private life, that the consort role removed the moment the accession made him the Queen's husband, rather than a naval officer who happened to be married to the heir to the throne. What the institution left him was the narrow private world that the institutional demands did not occupy. The carriage driving, the specific private social world of Windsor and Sandringham outside the formal occasions, the relationships that the private world contained, including Penny, the most significant of those relationships across the decades. The institution is not unique in producing this kind of cost. Any sufficiently demanding institutional identity, the demands of high political office, of military command at the highest levels, of the kind of public life that absorbs the person into the role, rather than simply occupying their professional time, produces comparable costs for the people who accept it. What is specific to the royal institutional context is the totality of the absorption and the duration of it. Philip gave the institution 70 years. No ordinary institutional demand produces that span of total service, and the costs of the service accumulate across the span in ways that shorter commitments cannot produce. The accumulation is visible in what Philip valued most about his private world. The carriage driving's appeal was the appeal of a context that valued him for what he did, rather than what he was. The specific relief of being in an environment organized around competence, rather than status. Penny's appeal was the appeal of a relationship that engaged with him as himself, rather than as the institution's primary male representative. The specific relief of being known by someone whose knowledge was organized around the person, rather than the position. Both of these reliefs were reliefs from the specific pressure of the institutional identity. The pressure of being always and exclusively the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband, the public figure whose institutional significance organized every social context he inhabited. The reliefs were what the narrow private world provided, and what Philip organized that narrow private world around providing for himself across the decades, when the institutional demands were most total and the private space most narrow. The institution never acknowledged what it had taken from Philip. The official account of his life organized around what he had given to it, the service, the loyalty, the specific suppression of his own interests in service of the institutional purpose, without engaging honestly with what the giving had cost. The cost was real. The person who bore the cost was real. The relationship with Penny was part of how the person bearing the cost managed to remain, across 99 years and 70 of institutional service, a person rather than simply a function. The institution produced the condition required the management produced the relationship sustained the person. The palace's silence about the relationship was the institution's final management of the account of its own costs, the organization of the official narrative around the service and the loyalty and the devotion, without the honest acknowledgement of what the service and the loyalty and the devotion had extracted from the man who provided them. The honest acknowledgement is overdue. The extraction was real. The management of its account has served the institution's preferred narrative for the full duration of the relationship's existence and beyond. The narrative is the narrative this account has been working against, the narrative of total institutional devotion, without the honest accounting of its personal cost. Philip was a person before he was a function. The person found, in Penny Knatchbull, across 4 decades of the narrowest available private space, the closest thing to being known as that person that the institutional life permitted. The finding mattered. The mattering is what the palace's silence was organized around not saying. The Philip and Penny story has been presented in various forms across various accounts of Philip's life, as gossip, as scandal, as the peripheral detail of a biography organized around the institutional life, as the footnote that the official account declines to expand into the text it warrants. None of those framings produces the honest account that the relationship's actual significance and its actual character require. The honest account is the account this document has been assembling across 14 preceding sections, and the summary of what that account establishes is the summary required before the analysis of what it means can be completed. Philip and Penny Knatchbull maintained a close, sustained, significant personal relationship across approximately 4 decades of Philip's adult life. The relationship was visible in the private social world they shared and documented in the public occasions where they appeared together with the consistency that the available record establishes. The palace managed the relationship's public account through strategic silence across its full duration, neither denying nor explaining the specific quality of Philip's private relationship with Penny in the terms the relationship's significance warranted. The relationship existed alongside Philip's marriage to the Queen in the specific architecture of a long institutional marriage whose private dimensions both parties managed, with the understanding that the institutional constraints required them to maintain the specific elements of private life that the institutional partnership could not fully accommodate. Those are the facts. The analysis of what they mean requires the honest engagement with the institutional context that the preceding account has provided. What the story means, at its most immediate level, is that Prince Philip was a more complicated and more human figure than the official portrait allows. The public performance was professional and sustained and impressive in its consistency across 70 years. The private man was a man with specific needs and specific relationships and a specific interior life that the official portrait consistently managed into the background of the institutional account. The relationship with Penny is the clearest available evidence of the private man, the man who needed to be known as himself, who found the closest available approximation to that knowing in a specific person across 4 decades, and who managed the finding within the narrow private space that the institutional life permitted. What the story means at a broader level is what the Philip and Penny story shares with the other accounts of institutional life that this account's various preceding scripts have examined. The Queen Mother's campaigns, the Andrew situation, the Charles and Diana marriage, the various ways that the institution of the British monarchy has shaped and sometimes damaged the specific human beings inside it. The common thread across those accounts is the common thread of an institution that prioritized its own preferred account over the honest one, that managed the private realities of the people inside it in service of the institutional narrative rather than in service of the people themselves, and that produced, in the specific costs imposed on specific human beings by the management operation, a record that the honest examination requires to be placed alongside the official one. Philip's record is the record of a man who gave the institution what the institution required across 70 years and who organized, in the narrow private space the institution left available, the closest thing to the life he would have chosen if the choice had been fully his. Penny was the central element of that closest thing. Her presence in his life, across 4 decades and through the final weeks of his life at Windsor, was the presence of someone who had given him the specific thing the institution could not. The experience of being known as himself by another person who had chosen to know him for the person he was, rather than the position he occupied. The palace never explained this. The official record does not address it in honest terms. The narrative organized around the devoted husband, the loyal consort, the man who gave everything to the institution, is the narrative that the management operation produced and sustained across the full length of the relationship's existence and through the tributes that followed Philip's death. The honest narrative is the one that includes Penny Knatchbull, not as a scandal, not as a betrayal, not as the embarrassing private reality behind the dignified public life, but as the evidence of what a person who gave everything to an institution needed to maintain across 4 decades in the narrow private space the institution left available, and as the evidence of what the institution's preferred account of itself consistently declines to acknowledge. Philip gave the institution everything. He kept Penny. The keeping was what the giving made necessary. The palace's silence about the keeping was the institution's final act of management, the organization of the public account of a man's life around the giving and away from the keeping, so that what was left in the official record was the account of total devotion to the institutional purpose, rather than the honest account of a person who sustained the total devotion by also sustaining, in the narrowest available private space, the one relationship that gave the person beneath the devotion somewhere to exist. The relationship existed, the person existed. The palace's silence was the management of the account of both. The account is here, the specific social world that made the Philip and Penny relationship possible, that provided its contexts, its occasions, its physical settings, its cover within the relevant world's code of discretion, was the world organized around the Brabornne family and the Broadlands estate. Broadlands is a Palladian mansion in Hampshire set in grounds designed by Capability Brown, and it had been Mountbatten's principal home across the decades of his active public life. It was the house where Charles and Diana had spent their honeymoon in 1981. It was the house where the Mountbatten family gathered for the significant occasions of its shared life. After Mountbatten's death, it passed to his daughter Patricia and her husband John Knatchbull, the 7th Baron Brabornne, and it remained the centre of the Brabornne family's social world across the subsequent decades. Philip was at Broadlands regularly after Mountbatten's death. His connection to the house was the connection to Mountbatten's memory and to the family that had inherited Mountbatten's world, and the connection was one he maintained with the consistency that characterized his relationship with everything that mattered to him genuinely rather than institutionally. He went there. He was comfortable there. The house and its grounds, and the social world organized around it, gave him access to the specific environment that Mountbatten had always provided. The environment in which he was family, rather than the Duke of Edinburgh, in which the institutional identity was the background, rather than the foreground, of every interaction. Patricia Brabornne, Mountbatten's daughter and Norton's mother, was a significant figure in Philip's life, in her own right. She had known Philip since he was a young man. She had watched him become the Queen's husband and the Duke of Edinburgh, and had maintained across the decades the specific kind of relationship with him that people who knew someone before their institutional identity consumed their personal one tend to maintain. A relationship organized partly around the institutional person, but also around the memory and the reality of the person who had existed before the institution took over. Patricia's relationship with Philip was the relationship that gave the Broadlands world its specific quality for him, the quality of a place and a social world where the pre-institutional Philip was remembered, and where the institutional Philip was engaged with, as a person, rather than simply as a position. The quality was the quality that had always made Mountbatten's world significant to Philip, and Patricia's maintenance of that quality in the world she had inherited gave it continuity across the decades after Mountbatten was gone. Norton Knatchbull was Philip's great-nephew through the Mountbatten connection, and the relationship between Philip and Norton was the relationship of two men connected through family and through the shared loss of Mountbatten and Nicholas across the decades of the relevant period. Norton had his own relationship with Philip, the relationship of a younger man who had grown up in the social world organized around Mountbatten, and who had maintained the connection to that world after Mountbatten's death through his own family's centrality in it. Penny entered this world through her marriage to Norton in 1979, arriving just months before the bombing that killed Mountbatten and Nicholas. The timing was the timing of someone who had entered a social world at the precise moment of its most acute crisis, and whose subsequent relationship with the world was shaped by the crisis that had marked her entry into it. She came into the Brabornne world as a young wife, and was immediately immersed in the specific experience of catastrophic family loss that the bombing produced, and the immersion shaped her relationship with the world and with the people in it, in ways that an ordinary social entry could not have produced. Philip was among the people in that world. The bombing connected Philip and Penny in the specific way that shared catastrophic experience connects people, through the particular quality of understanding between people who have been through the same thing, in the specific circumstances of people who are connected through the same family network and who navigate the aftermath within that network's shared life. The Broadlands and Brabornne social world was the primary physical and social context of the relationship across the years of its development. The occasions organized around the estate, the shooting weekends, the family gatherings, the social occasions of a significant aristocratic household maintaining its social function across the decades, were the occasions where Philip and Penny were consistently in the same space in the private rather than the public context. The private context was what the relationship required, and what the Brabornne world provided. Philip, in the Brabornne context, was not attending an official engagement or performing a public function. He was in the home of people he was related to through Mountbatten, in a social world organized around the family connection, present in the specific way that family members are present at each other's private occasions. Penny was part of that family world through her marriage to Norton. Her presence in the same contexts was the presence of a family member rather than of a social acquaintance, and the family member status gave the proximity a naturalness and a legitimacy within the relevant world's codes that social acquaintance proximity would not have had. The naturalness was the cover, not cover in the sense of deliberate concealment. The relationship was not hidden within the Broadlands world, which knew what it was with the accuracy of close communities that observe each other's private lives with the attention of people whose social world is organized around shared occasions and shared knowledge. Cover in the sense that the legitimate family connection gave the proximity an explanation that prevented its specific character from being the first question asked by outside observers. Philip was at Broadlands because of his connection to Mountbatten's family. Penny was at Broadlands because she had married into Mountbatten's family. The connection between them in that context was the connection between two people in the same family social world, and the specific quality of their relationship within that context was the private knowledge of the people inside it, rather than the public question of the people outside it. The Broadlands world's code of discretion was the code that kept the private knowledge inside the relevant world across the full duration of the relationship. The code was real, and it was enforced with the consistency of a social world that had long experience of managing private realities within the specific framework of aristocratic discretion. The people who knew what Philip and Penny were to each other understood that the knowing was private knowledge rather than public information, and they maintained the distinction with the seriousness that the code required. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The code held across 4 decades. The Broadlands world kept what it knew. The palace managed the public account. The relationship continued in the specific private context that the Brabornne family's world provided, in the settings and the occasions and the social fabric of a significant English aristocratic household maintaining its life across the decades. What the Brabornne connection made possible was not simply the physical occasion for the relationship, the specific settings where Philip and Penny could be together in the private context. It made possible the specific social framework within which the relationship existed and was understood by the people closest to it. The framework was the framework of family connection and shared loss, and the specific social world organized around the Mountbatten legacy. Within that framework, the Philip and Penny relationship was a relationship that the relevant world could accommodate within its existing codes rather than requiring the development of a new framework to contain it. The accommodation was the key. The relationship did not require managing in the sense of deliberate concealment within the relevant world, because the relevant world's existing framework provided the natural context within which it existed. The management that was required was the management of the public account, the palace's strategic silence, rather than the management of the private world's knowledge of the relationship. The private world knew, the code kept the knowing where it was. The palace managed the boundary between the private world's knowledge and the public account. The relationship continued in the space that the management created between those two things. 4 decades of that space. 4 decades of the relationship in it. The space was narrow. The relationship was real. The Brabornne connection was what made the space available. The marriage of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II lasted 73 years, from November 1947 until Philip's death in April 2021. It produced 4 children. It survived the abdication crisis's shadow, the post-war reconstruction of the monarchy, the specific institutional pressures of the Cold War decades, the social changes of the 1960s and 1970s, the Wales marriage catastrophe of the 1980s and 1990s, Diana's death, the Andrew situation, and the full range of personal and institutional challenges that 73 years at the center of British public life produces. The survival across that span is the fact that the official account most emphasizes, and the emphasis is not wrong. 73 years is a long time, the survival of a marriage across 73 years of the most demanding institutional life available in the 20th century, is an achievement of some kind, and the official account's celebration of it, as an achievement, is not the official account being dishonest. The official account is being selective. The celebration of the survival omits the honest description of what the marriage actually was, what it provided to both parties, what it required of both parties, and what both parties sought and found outside it, in the private spaces that the institutional life left available to them. Marriage was an institutional partnership. This is not a harsh description. It is an accurate one. The specific demands of the role that both Philip and the Queen had committed themselves to serving meant that the marriage's primary function was the function of the institutional partnership, the presentation of a united, stable, devoted couple at the center of the monarchy's public life, sustained across decades, with the consistency that the institutional requirement demanded. The presentation was real, in the sense that the partnership was genuine. Philip and the Queen were genuinely committed to the same institutional purpose. They were genuinely affectionate toward each other in the specific way that two people who have been through everything together are affectionate. Through the accumulated shared experience of 70 years, through the specific texture of daily life in the same household across that span, through the particular kind of knowing that sustained proximity produces between two people. The affection was not the same as the intimate partnership that the marriage ceremony promises, and that the official tribute after Philip's death presented it as being. The specific intimate partnership of a marriage, the shared emotional interior, the primary relationship of confidant and witness to each other's deepest life, was a partnership that the institutional constraints of their specific life made more difficult to achieve than the official portrait acknowledges. The Queen's primary professional relationship was with the institution she headed. The demands of that relationship, the boxes, the audiences, the constitutional machinery, the endless engagement with the political and governmental and Commonwealth dimensions of the sovereign's role, consumed the majority of her waking hours and organized the primary structure of her daily life. The personal relationship with her husband existed within and around that primary professional relationship, rather than occupying the central position in her daily life that a more conventionally intimate marriage would have produced. Philip's primary role was the consort's role, the walking behind, the public support, the institutional presence at the institution's public occasions. The role was demanding, and it was performed professionally. It was not, in the specific terms that matter for understanding what the marriage was and what it needed to be, a role that gave Philip a primary relationship with the Queen as a person, rather than as the institution he was serving. The distinction between relating to a person and relating to the institution a person heads is a distinction that the specific demands of the Windsor marriage made difficult to maintain, clearly, across 70 years. The Queen was both the person Elizabeth and the institutional sovereign. Philip was both the person he was and the Duke of Edinburgh. Their relationship across 70 years was the relationship between those doubled identities, the specific complexity of two people who were also two functions, in a marriage that was also an institutional arrangement. Navigating the daily reality of that complexity with the professionalism the institutional demand required, and the private humanity the personal reality needed. The private humanity found its expression in the private spaces. The Queen's friendship with Henry Porchester was the expression of a dimension of her private life that the institutional partnership did not fully accommodate. The specific relationship with someone who engaged with her as a person passionate about horses, rather than as the sovereign heading an institution. Philip's friendship with Penny was the expression of a comparable dimension, the relationship with someone who engaged with him as a person, rather than as the institution's primary male representative. Both relationships were part of the private architecture of the same marriage. Both were known within the relevant world. Both were managed in the official account through the same strategic silence that the palace applied to every private reality that the public account was not organized to accommodate. The marriage's private architecture was not shameful. It was the architecture that the institutional constraints of the most demanding institutional life available in the 20th century produced in two people who had committed themselves to serving it across their full lives. The architecture included the institutional partnership at its center and the private friendships at its edges, and the private friendships served the function of sustaining the people inside the institutional partnership across the decades that the partnership demanded of them. Philip's relationship with Penny was one of the private friendships at the edges. It was the most sustained and the most significant of those friendships in the decades of his later life. The marriage's architecture included it as an element whose function was the function that the institutional partnership could not fully perform. The engagement with Philip as himself, the knowing of the person rather than the position, the specific ease of a relationship organized around genuine personal qualities rather than institutional significance. The Queen knew the architecture. She had built it alongside Philip across 70 years. The knowing was part of what the 70 years produced between them. The specific mutual understanding of two people who had lived the same extraordinary institutional life, and who understood, with the clarity that only the inside of such a life can produce, what the institutional life required, and what it left room for, and what it consistently denied. Philip is the statement of what it left room for. Penny is the relationship he organized that room around. The Queen is the person who understood and managed the architecture that made both possible. The marriage was what the institutional life produced between two people who committed themselves to it fully, and who found, within the narrow private space the institutional life permitted, the ways to remain people rather than simply functions across the full span of the service they had chosen. The private space included Penny. The marriage included the private space. The official account excluded the honest description of both. The honest description is here. The British tabloid press in the 1980s and 1990s was the most aggressive royal coverage press in the world. It had access, through the specific combination of paid sources, surveillance technology, and the particular culture of competition between titles that Fleet Street maintained across that period, to the private lives of the royal family, at a level of detail that the palace found consistently alarming and consistently failed to fully prevent. The Wales marriage's private deterioration was documented in the tabloid press through a combination of sources close to both parties, recorded telephone conversations, and the specific investigative journalism that the commercial appetite for royal coverage funded at significant professional investment. The Philip and Penny relationship was not documented in the tabloid press in the same way. The restraint is a fact that the honest account is required to examine and explain, because the restraint was not the result of the tabloid press failing to notice a relationship that existed in the same social world as the Wales marriage, and that was visible to many of the same people who were providing the tabloids with their Wales marriage coverage. The restraint was the result of several specific factors, operating simultaneously across the period of the relationship's most visible development. The first factor was Philip himself. Philip's relationship with the British press was a relationship he had managed for 40 years by the time the tabloid press reached its most aggressive phase in the mid-1980s. The management had produced a specific mutual understanding between Philip and the press that was different from the understanding between the press and the other senior royals whose private lives were most aggressively covered. Philip gave the press what it needed from him in terms of public access and public statements, the specific cooperation with the institutional coverage that the press required to fulfill its function, and the press reciprocated with a degree of restraint about his private life that it did not extend to Charles or Diana or the other royals whose institutional positions were less clearly defined and whose relationship with the press was less stably managed. The specific nature of the mutual understanding is not something the press documented explicitly, because the documentation of such understandings tends to undermine their continued operation. What the available evidence supports is the conclusion that Philip's management of his press relationship across 40 years had produced a specific restraint around his private life that the press honored with a consistency that the commercial appetite for royal coverage would not naturally produce in the absence of some specific management producing it. The second factor was the specific social world in which the relationship existed. The Brabornne family's world, the carriage driving world, the Windsor and Sandringham social circle, these were worlds that the tabloid press's source network penetrated less effectively than it penetrated the worlds organized around Charles and Diana's social lives. The Wales marriage's private deterioration was covered by the tabloid press in large part because both Charles and Diana had people close to them who were willing to provide information to the press, for various reasons and through various channels. Philip's private world was organized around people whose relationship with the press was the relationship of the relevant social world's code, the specific discretion that the Brabornne family's aristocratic world maintained around the private realities of the people within it. The code was more robust in the Philip and Penny context than it had been in the Wales marriage context, where the specific breakdown of trust between the two parties to the marriage had produced the particular dynamic in which both sides had incentive to communicate their version of the private reality to sympathetic press contacts. Philip and Penny did not have competing interests in their relationship's private management. Neither party to the relationship had incentive to provide information to the press that would expose the relationship's private character. The code of the relevant social world enforced the discretion that neither party's individual interest would have required them to breach. The third factor was the specific legal risk of the tabloid coverage of Philip's private life. Philip was not a person who accepted press intrusion into his private life without response, and the press understood that intrusive coverage of his private relationships carried specific legal risks that the commercial value of the coverage might not justify. The specific legal caution around coverage of the most senior royals was a real factor in editorial decisions about what to pursue and what to leave alone, and Philip's private life fell into the category of what to leave alone more reliably than the Wales marriage had done. The fourth factor was the specific timing of the relationship's development relative to the tabloid press's most aggressive period. The relationship between Philip and Penny developed from the early 1980s, and the most visible dimensions of it were the dimensions of the carriage-driving world and the Brabornne social occasions that the equestrian press and the social pages documented in the coverage of those specific worlds. By the time the tabloid press was operating at its most aggressive in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Philip and Penny relationship had been sufficiently established in the relevant social world's understanding that the specific investigative effort required to document it for tabloid coverage would have produced a story that the tabloid press had to calculate against the specific combination of legal risk, source reliability, and commercial value. Calculation produced restraint. The restraint was the commercial and legal assessment of the tabloid press in the specific circumstances of the Philip and Penny story, operating alongside the management of the press relationship that Philip had conducted across 40 years and the code of discretion that the relevant social world maintained around its private realities. The restraint is not the same as ignorance. The relevant journalists knew that Penny Knatchbull was a consistent presence in Philip's private world. The knowing was the knowing of people whose professional function gave them the access to understand what was visible in the relevant social world. The restraint was the decision, made on the specific calculation of the circumstances, not to pursue the story in the terms that the tabloid press's commercial appetite for royal coverage would naturally produce. The decision produced the specific absence from the tabloid press record of the kind of coverage that the Wales marriage received, and that would have placed the Philip and Penny relationship in the public account in the terms its actual character warranted. The absence from the tabloid record contributed to the broader public absence of the honest account of the relationship. The specific combination of the palace's strategic silence and the press's restraint that produced, across the full duration of the relationship, a public record organized around what neither party chose to say. What neither party chose to say is what this account has been assembled to say. The press restraint was real. The palace silence was real. The relationship was real. The honest account of all three things together is the account that the public record, across the 4 decades of the relationship's duration, consistently failed to produce. Philip died on the morning of April 9, 2021, at Windsor Castle. The official announcement was brief and formal, as palace announcements of royal deaths always are. The time of death, the location, the expression of condolence from the royal family. The announcement confirmed what the preceding weeks had made clear to anyone following the available information, that Philip's health had declined, to the point where his death was the expected conclusion of the process. What the announcement did not include, and what the official account of Philip's final weeks consistently declined to address directly, was the specific account of who was present with Philip in those final weeks. and what their presence communicated about the private architecture of his life at its most essential. The COVID restrictions of early 2021 had reduced the population of Windsor Castle to the people who were there within the specific bubble that the palace managed for the Queen and Philip during the acute phase of the pandemic. The bubble was small, the Queen was there, certain household staff were there, and Penny Knatchbull was there, present in the final weeks of Philip's life in the specific way that a person is present at the end of another person's life when the relationship that places them there is the relationship that has mattered most. The presence was not incidental or casual. Philip was 99 years old and seriously ill. The COVID restrictions meant that the people present at Windsor were the people who had made the specific arrangements required to be within the bubble, arrangements that required deliberate planning and institutional management rather than the simple social proximity of people who happened to be in the same place. Penny's presence within the bubble was a deliberate arrangement, made by or for Philip in the specific circumstances of his final weeks, that placed her in the small circle of people with consistent access to him as his health declined. The deliberateness of the arrangement is the evidence of the relationship's significance at that point. A 99-year-old man in serious illness, in the most restricted conditions of a global pandemic, is not in a position to maintain social relationships out of social habit or institutional courtesy. The people present in those circumstances are the people whose presence is actively wanted, the people whose company the dying person has chosen for the specific circumstances of the end of their life, in the conditions where everything peripheral has been stripped away, and what remains is what actually matters. Penny remained. The remaining was the statement. The palace did not explain the statement. The official account of Philip's final weeks, and of his death, and of the tributes that followed his death, did not place Penny Knatchbull in the position that her presence in those final weeks documented her occupying. The funeral on April 17, 2021, at St. George's Chapel, was limited to 30 people by the COVID restrictions that had organized every aspect of the preceding year's public life. 30 people was a small number for the funeral of a senior member of the British royal family. Philip's funeral in ordinary circumstances would have been a state occasion attended by hundreds of official mourners and thousands of public onlookers. The restrictions reduced it to the 30 people who were most essential to be there. Penny was among the 30. She was seated with the family in the chapel rather than in a separate section designated for non-family guests. The seating arrangement at significant royal occasions is not incidental. It is managed by the palace's household officials with the specific attention to precedence and relationship that the royal world applies to every significant occasion. The placement of a specific person in the family section rather than the guest section is a placement that communicates the person's relationship to the deceased in the terms the placement system uses. Phase, terms organized around closeness rather than around institutional or social status. The placement placed Penny in the terms of closeness. The palace, in managing the funeral seating arrangements, placed her where the relationship's actual nature suggested she belonged. The same palace that had managed the public account of the relationship through 4 decades of strategic silence, managed the funeral arrangements in a way that produced the clearest available public statement of the relationship's significance. The statement was not accompanied by explanation. The photographs from the funeral that documented the seating arrangement documented it without the palace providing the account of what the arrangement meant. The public and press coverage of the funeral noted Penny's presence in the family section with the brevity that the absence of palace explanation produced, a noted detail without a context, a visible fact without an official interpretation. The visible fact is the clearest evidence available in the public record of what Philip and Penny were to each other. At the end of his life, in the most restricted possible circumstances, she was there. At the ceremony that concluded his life, in the smallest possible gathering of the people who mattered most, she was placed in the section for the people who were closest. 4 decades of a relationship, documented across the available record, in the consistent presence and the managed silence, and the accumulated evidence of the carriage-driving world, and the Brabornne social occasions, and the Windsor private life, concluded with Penny at Windsor, and Penny at the funeral, and Penny in the family section. The palace said nothing about what it meant. The meaning is what this account has spent 15 preceding sections establishing. The final weeks and the funeral seating were not the beginning of an explanation. They were the conclusion of a story whose explanation the palace had managed in silence for 4 decades, and whose conclusion made the silence its own kind of statement. The statement said, "She mattered." The 4 decades said, "She mattered for a long time." The funeral placement said, "She mattered enough to be here, in this section, at this moment, when the 30 people present were the 30 people who most needed to be." Philip is buried at Windsor. Penny was there when he was buried. The being there was the final documentation of the relationship's significance in the one context where the documentation could not be managed into invisibility by strategic silence. The context of a public occasion with authorized photographs and a congregation of 30 people, where the presence of a specific person in a specific section of the chapel is a fact in the photographic record, regardless of what the palace chooses to say about it. The palace chose to say nothing. The photographic record says something. This account says what the photographic record and the full body of available evidence together establish. That Penny Knatchbull was the most significant personal relationship of Philip's adult life outside the marriage. That the relationship lasted 4 decades. That it was present at the end. And that the palace's management of the public account of that relationship across its full duration was the institutional management of a private reality that the institution's preferred account of Philip's life could not accommodate. The honest account accommodates it. The palace's strategic silence about the Philip and Penny relationship was not a silence about nothing. It was a silence organized around a specific set of institutional interests, protecting a specific set of institutional narratives, in service of the specific public account of Philip's life and of the Windsor marriage that the institution required to be the dominant public account. The interests the silence protected were the interests of the official portrait of Philip as the loyal consort, as the devoted husband, the man who had given everything to the institution and whose private life was the private life the official portrait required. The official portrait was commercially and institutionally valuable. It was the portrait that sustained the public affection for Philip that the institution's public standing required, that provided the human complement to the Queen's constitutional authority, that placed at the center of the monarchy's family narrative a devoted couple whose devotion was the human story around which the institution's public legitimacy was organized. The portrait was not entirely false. The devotion was real in specific dimensions. The institutional partnership was genuine. The affection across 70 years was genuine. The shared commitment to the institutional purpose was genuine. These were the real elements that the official portrait was built around, and their reality gave the portrait sufficient foundation to sustain itself across the full duration of the relationship's existence and through the tributes that followed Philip's death. The silence protected the portrait by protecting the specific elements of the private reality that were inconsistent with it: the Penny relationship, the pattern of close friendships with other women across Philip's adult life, the specific private architecture of a marriage that sustained itself across 70 years through the accommodation of dimensions the official portrait did not address. The protection served the institution. It served the specific institutional interest in the public account of the Windsor marriage as the devoted partnership the tributes described. It served the institutional interest in Philip's public legacy as the loyal consort who had given everything to the institution. It served the institutional interest in maintaining the public narrative that the monarchy's family life was organized around values that the presence of the Penny relationship in the honest account would have complicated. What the protection cost was the honest account of a specific person. Philip was not the official portrait. He was a more complicated and more human person whose private life included dimensions that the official portrait consistently excluded, and the exclusion impoverished the public account of his life in the specific way that all managed accounts impoverish the subjects they manage. The impoverishment was most acute in the specific dimension of what Philip's private life reveals about the costs of the institutional life he had lived. The official portrait of Philip as the loyal consort who gave everything to the institution is a portrait that celebrates the giving without examining the cost. The honest account, the account that includes Penny and the other close friendships, and the private architecture of the marriage, and the specific interior life of a man who needed to be known as himself, and found the narrowest possible space to be known in, is the account that makes the cost visible, The cost was real. Philip paid it across 99 years. The institution consumed what it consumed and left what it left. And what it left was the narrow private space in which he organized, with the intelligence and the discipline that characterized everything he did, the closest available approximation to the life he would have chosen if the choice had been his. The silence that protected the official portrait also protected the institution from the honest examination of what it had taken from Philip. The taking was real, and the silence about it was the institution's final management of the account of its own costs. The organization of the public record around what Philip gave to the institution, rather than what the institution took from Philip. The taking included the name, the career, the independence, the freedom to be a person rather than a function, across the full span of an adult life, lived at the center of the most publicly constrained institutional context available in the 20th century. What Philip kept, in the narrow private space, was Penny. The keeping was the evidence of what the taking had cost. The silence about the keeping was the institution's management of the evidence of the cost. The management served the institution. The institution survived Philip's death, with the official portrait intact, the loyal consort, the devoted husband, the man who gave everything. The Penny relationship was noted in passing in various accounts and tributes, never examined in the terms its duration and its significance warranted, never placed in the public record in a position that would have required the official portrait to accommodate the honest account of what the portrait was organized around not showing. The honest account was not produced by the institution. It was not produced by the palace's authorized accounts of Philip's life. It was not produced by the tributes that followed his death, or by the coverage of the funeral that noted Penny's presence in the family section, without explaining what the presence documented. The honest account is produced here, assembled from the available evidence across the full span of the relationship's duration, and through the final weeks, and the funeral seating, and the specific statement of significance that the available evidence places beyond serious question. Philip and Penny. 4 decades. The palace said nothing. This account says what the palace managed in silence across those 4 decades. The honest account of the most significant personal relationship of Philip's adult life, outside the marriage that the institution required him to make the public center of his life. The silence is broken here. The account is the breaking. The pattern of Philip's close relationships with specific women across his adult life is a pattern that the official account of his life has consistently declined to examine as a pattern, treating each relationship as an isolated social fact rather than as one instance of a recurring choice that reveals something consistent about what Philip needed and consistently sought in his private relationships. The women most clearly documented in connection with Philip's private life across the relevant decades were women of specific and comparable qualities, and the comparison across the documented cases produces a clearer picture of what Philip was looking for than the examination of any single relationship provides. Pat Kirkwood was an actress and performer who was one of the most celebrated entertainers of her generation in Britain. Philip met her in 1948, less than a year after his marriage to Elizabeth, at a private party organized through mutual connections. The relationship that developed was sufficiently close and sufficiently visible in the social world of the period to generate the specific kind of talk that the relevant world was organized around containing. And the talk persisted in the institutional world's private memory long enough to produce, decades later, the specific legal dispute about its public characterization that Kirkwood's later life was partly organized around addressing. What Kirkwood offered Philip was specific and is documented in the accounts of people who knew them both during the relevant period. She was professionally accomplished in a context entirely outside the royal world, the variety theatre, the West End stage, the specific world of post-war British popular entertainment that was organized around talent and work, rather than around birth and institutional position. She was direct in company, warm but not deferential, possessed of the professional confidence of someone whose standing came from what she did, rather than who she was by birth or marriage. She treated Philip as someone whose qualities were worth engaging with, rather than as someone whose significance required a specific quality of managed deference. The qualities she offered were the qualities that the pattern across Philip's private relationships consistently documents: the direct engagement, the absence of deference, the relationship with him organized around his actual person rather than his institutional position, the specific relief of those qualities in the life of a man whose every social context was organized around his institutional significance, was the relief this account has described in relation to Penny, the relief of being engaged with as himself rather than as the Duke of Edinburgh. Hélène Cordet was a French cabaret singer and television presenter who had known Philip from their shared time in Paris in the early 1930s, when both were young people in the specific world of European aristocratic social life before the war. The connection predated his institutional identity entirely. She had known him as a young man before he was anything more than a prince without a country, without institutional significance, without the specific weight of the consort's role that would subsequently organize every dimension of his public life. The connection that predated the institutional identity was therefore a connection to a version of Philip that the institutional identity had subsequently overlaid. The version that had existed before the accession and the consort's role and the specific suppression of the personal in service of the institutional that the role required. Cordet maintained contact with Philip across the subsequent decades, and the maintenance of the contact was the maintenance of a connection to the pre-institutional person that the institutional life had made increasingly difficult to access through any other channel. She offered him what the pre-institutional connection always offers people whose adult lives have been entirely shaped by institutional identity, the specific memory of who they were before the institution consumed their identity, and the relationship organized around that pre-institutional person rather than around the institutional version. The Countess Mountbatten, Patricia Brabornne, has appeared in various accounts of Philip's private life in terms that the code of the relevant world has made consistently oblique. What is documentable is the sustained closeness of the relationship across the decades following her father's death, and the specific quality of the relationship as described by people who observed them together in the Broadlands context, a warmth and an ease that reflected genuine personal connection rather than institutional social courtesy. Patricia was Mountbatten's daughter. She had known Philip through Mountbatten across decades of the Mountbatten connection. She remembered Philip from before the accession, from the period when he was Mountbatten's nephew rather than the Queen's husband. The knowing from before was the knowing that gave the relationship its specific quality, the engagement with Philip as himself, informed by the long history of the Mountbatten connection, in the specific social world of Broadlands, where the pre-institutional Philip was remembered. Penny was the most sustained and the most significant of the relationships this pattern documents. What she shared with the other women in the pattern was the specific combination of direct personal engagement, the absence of organized deference, genuine quality in her own right that made the relationship one between two people of independent standing, rather than between the Duke of Edinburgh and someone whose primary relationship to him was organized around his significance. What she had in addition to those shared qualities was the specific connection through shared grief that the 1979 bombing produced. The genuine shared passion for the carriage driving that gave the relationship a practical shared context across decades, and the specific longevity of the connection, 4 decades, that distinguished it from every other relationship in the pattern. The pattern across the documented cases reveals a consistent need. The need was the need that this account has described throughout its length, the need to be known as himself by someone whose knowledge was organized around the person rather than the position. The specific women who appear in the pattern were women who met that need in the specific circumstances and contexts of Philip's private life, across the decades of the institutional life that produced the need. The pattern is not a scandal. It is a portrait of a person managing a specific and extraordinary institutional constraint across the full span of an adult life, through the specific means available to someone in his specific circumstances, the close relationships with specific women who offered him the quality of engagement that the institutional life consistently prevented him from finding within it. The palace managed the pattern in silence. The silence served the official portrait. The pattern, examined honestly, serves the honest portrait. The portrait of a person rather than a function, of a man who needed what most people need, and who found the narrowest available ways to get it within the extraordinary constraints of his extraordinary life. The specific role of consort to a British Queen regnant has been occupied by two people in the modern era: Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's husband, and Philip, who was Elizabeth II's husband. Albert died in 1861 after 21 years of marriage. Philip died in 2021 after 73 years of marriage. The comparison between the two men and their experience of the consort's role is limited by the distance between their historical contexts, but the comparison illuminates something specific about what Philip's version of the role required that the official account has consistently understated. Albert's approach to the consort's role was the approach of someone who attempted to define it actively, to find within the institutional constraint a space for genuine political and cultural engagement that gave the role substantive content beyond its ceremonial function. He was involved in the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851. He engaged with the constitutional dimensions of the monarchy's relationship with the government in ways that the political context of the mid-19th century permitted. He brought to the role an intellectual energy and a practical ambition that gave him, within the specific constraints of the position, a sense of substantive purpose that extended beyond the ceremonial. Philip attempted something comparable. The Duke of Edinburgh Award, established in 1956, was his most significant contribution to the substantive content of the consort's role, a program that genuinely reflected his values and his understanding of what young people needed, that the institutional life he had experienced had not provided, and that he engaged with throughout his life with the consistency of someone who found in it a genuine purpose rather than a ceremonial function. He was involved in the early development of the World Wildlife Fund and its conservation agenda. He chaired committees and delivered speeches and engaged with organizations attached to his patronages with a seriousness that the people who worked with him in those contexts consistently describe as genuine. The substantive engagement was real. It was also consistently secondary to the primary function of the consort's role, which was the public support of the Queen in her constitutional and ceremonial functions, the walking behind, the standing beside, the specific management of the consort's public presence at the events organized around the sovereign's role rather than around the consort's own. The primary function consumed the majority of Philip's public time across the decades of the active working role, and the primary function's demands organized the public life in ways that the substantive engagement existed around, rather than at the center of. The psychological cost of the primary function's demands is the dimension of Philip's experience of the consort's role that the official account most consistently avoids addressing directly. A man of Philip's specific qualities, the professional competence, the naval career achievement, the genuine intellectual engagement, the physical capability, and the competitive instinct that the Carriage driving documented across 3 decades of serious competition, placed in a role whose primary function was to support someone else's exercise of authority, was a man in a specific kind of tension that the official portrait of devoted consort systematically manages into invisibility. The tension was real, and it produced specific behaviors across Philip's public life that the press documented without fully examining in the context of what they revealed about the tension's source. The sharp humor, the specific impatience with ceremonial demands that his public conduct occasionally displayed, the particular abruptness in social interactions where the required performance of deference to the institutional occasion conflicted with his natural directness. These were behaviors whose character is more legible against the background of the specific tension the consort's role produced than they are against the background of the official portrait of a man comfortable in his institutional position. Philip was not comfortable in the institutional position in the specific sense that people who are suited to leading rather than following are not comfortable in following positions. He was professional about the position. He performed it with the discipline of someone who had decided the decision was made and would be honored. The professionalism was genuine and the discipline was genuine, and both were the products of a character that had organized itself around the making and honoring of decisions, rather than around the comfort of the position those decisions produced. The discomfort was managed privately and expressed publicly in the specific behaviors the press documented as gaffes, the impatient comments, the sharp observations, the particular manner that could read as brusque in contexts where the institutional occasion required the management of a different register. The gaffes were the pressure release of the tension. The tension was the consort's specific experience of a role that placed the secondary position as the permanent condition of a life that the person inhabiting the secondary position was constitutionally unsuited to inhabit as anything other than a primary one. The carriage driving was the primary mechanism through which the tension was managed in the private sphere. The competition gave Philip the specific experience of being the primary figure in his own right, the driver whose skill and judgment determined the outcome, the competitor whose performance was assessed on its own terms, the person whose standing in the relevant world was the standing of his own achievement rather than the standing conferred by his proximity to the sovereign. The management was real, and it served a genuine psychological function across the decades of Philip's engagement with the sport. Penny was the relationship dimension of the same management. She was the person in whose company the consort's secondary position was most consistently suspended, whose engagement with Philip was the engagement with the primary person he was in his own right, whose relationship with him was organized around his qualities rather than his institutional function, whose knowing of him was the knowing of the person the institutional position was organized around. The cost of the consort's role was the cost of the specific suppression the role required, the suppression of the primary person instinct in service of the secondary person function, across 70 years of public life at the highest level of institutional visibility. The cost was real. The management of the cost, through the carriage driving, and through the relationship with Penny, and through the other close friendships of the private world, was real. The official account's management of those management mechanisms into strategic silence was the institution's consistent protection of the preferred portrait at the cost of the honest one. The honest portrait includes the cost and the management of the cost and the specific relationship that was the most significant element of the management across 4 decades of the consort's life. The portrait is here. The available record of the Philip and Penny relationship is the record assembled across this account from the specific fragments of evidence that the palace's strategic silence and the relevant world's code of discretion left available to the honest examination. The record includes the documentation of consistent presence in shared occasions across 4 decades, the carriage driving competitions, the Brabornne family social occasions, the Windsor and Sandringham private social worlds, the specific public events where both were present with the regularity that casual social overlap between people in the same social world does not produce. The consistency is the primary evidential foundation. 4 decades of consistent documented presence in the same private contexts, with the frequency the available record establishes, is not the record of a peripheral social connection. It is the record of a significant sustained relationship. The record includes the accounts of people who observed them together in those contexts, and who have described, through the specific channels of private testimony that the passage of time and the loosening of the code of discretion allow, the specific quality of the interaction. The quality described is consistent across the independent accounts, the ease, the directness, the specific manner of 2 people who were genuinely comfortable with each other in a way that the institutional social world around Philip rarely produced, and that the carriage driving world and the Brabornne family world made more consistently available. The record includes the specific circumstances of Philip's final weeks at Windsor and of his funeral, the presence within the COVID bubble at Windsor, the placement in the family section at St. George's Chapel, the specific evidential weight of both facts in the context of who is present at the end of a life when everything peripheral has been removed, and what remains is what actually matters. The record includes the pattern of Philip's private relationships across his adult life, the documented cases of close, sustained relationships with specific women that the pattern analysis produces, and the consistent qualities those women shared that reveal what Philip was consistently seeking in his private relationships and consistently finding in the narrow private spaces the institutional life left available. The record is incomplete. The palace's strategic silence across 4 decades, the relevant world's code of discretion, and the specific institutional management of the public account of Philip's life have produced a record organized around what the management chose not to say, rather than around what the honest examination requires to be said. The incomplete record is the product of the incomplete account. The incomplete account is the product of the institutional interest in the official portrait. What the incomplete record is sufficient to establish is established beyond the threshold of serious question by the available evidence. The relationship was real. It lasted 4 decades. It was the most significant personal relationship of Philip's adult life outside the marriage. It was present at the end of his life in the circumstances that most directly communicate a relationship's significance. The palace said nothing about it across the full duration and beyond. What the record does not establish with the specificity that full documentation would produce is the precise nature of the relationship in its most intimate dimensions. Whether the relationship included a physical dimension, what the specific emotional character of the relationship was across its various phases, what Philip said about Penny in the private contexts where his statements about the people closest to him were made. These dimensions are in the private record rather than the public one, and the private record has not been made available to the honest examination in the forms that would allow the specific characterization of those dimensions. The honest account acknowledges the limitation. The available record establishes what it establishes and does not claim to establish what it cannot. The relationship was real and significant and sustained and present at the end. The specific character of its most intimate dimensions is in the private record, where the palace and the relevant world's code of discretion have kept it across 4 decades. What the record tells us about Philip is what this account has been assembled to tell. It tells us that the official portrait of the loyal consort, the devoted husband, the man whose private life was entirely organized around the institutional partnership, is a portrait organized around a managed selection from the available evidence, rather than around the full, honest account of a person's private life. The selection served the institution. The institution's service is the institution's interest. The honest account serves the person. Philip was a person before he was a function. The person had a private life that included Penny Knatchbull across 4 decades of the institutional function's most demanding period. The private life was managed in strategic silence by the institution whose public account was organized around what the strategic silence protected. The protection served the portrait. The portrait served the institution. The honest account of the person behind the portrait is the account assembled here from the fragments the management left available. The fragments are the record. The record is here. The record tells us what the palace managed in silence across 4 decades, and what the honest examination assembles from what the silence left visible. Philip and Penny. 4 decades. The palace said nothing. This account says what the palace managed not to say. That is the record, and what it tells us. The most significant feature of Penny Knatchbull's public conduct across the 4 decades of her relationship with Philip is the feature that is most easily overlooked, because it is defined by absence rather than presence. She never spoke about the relationship, not in interviews, not in authorized accounts, not in the social occasions where the relevant world's private knowledge was available for the specific kind of oblique acknowledgement that aristocratic discretion permits without requiring the explicit statement that the code prohibits. The silence was total, and it was sustained across the full duration of the relationship and beyond it. After Philip's death in April 2021, when the tributes and the accounts and the authorized biographical material that follows a senior royal's death created the specific conditions in which people close to the deceased are sometimes invited to contribute to the record, Penny said nothing. The accounts that emerged after Philip's death drew on the standard sources: household staff, longtime associates, the people whose professional relationship with Philip gave them material for the tribute accounts that the palace and the authorized biographers managed through the standard channels. Penny was not among the sources. Her silence continued past his death, as it had continued through his life. The silence is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who has decided that what they have to say belongs in the private record rather than the public one, and who has maintained that decision with the consistency of genuine conviction rather than external pressure across 40 years. The distinction matters because it tells us something about Penny's own understanding of what the relationship was and what it required of her. People who maintain total public silence about a relationship across 40 years are people who have made a specific decision about the relationship's proper location in the public and private record, and the decision reflects something about how they understand the relationship's character and its claims. The decision Penny made was the decision that the relationship was private in the specific sense that it belonged to the people inside it, rather than to the public account of the significant person it connected her to. The relationship was hers and Philip's. It was not the palace's, not the press's, not the public's. The silence was the maintenance of the boundary between what belonged to the relationship and what belonged to the public account of the relevant person's life. The maintenance across 40 years required the specific quality of steadiness that several accounts of Penny's character describe as one of her primary attributes, the quality of someone who has decided something and holds to the decision without the need for public reinforcement or the anxiety of wondering whether the decision remains correct. The steadiness was the quality that sustained the silence across the specific circumstances that would have created the greatest pressure for disclosure. The Camillagate period of the early 1990s, when the tabloid press was at its most aggressive about royal private lives. The Diana years, when the royal family's private arrangements were the most publicly scrutinized they had ever been. The various specific occasions across the decades when Philip's name appeared in press accounts that touched on his private relationships and that created the specific conditions where a person connected to those relationships might calculate that disclosure was the better available option. The disclosure never came. The silence held across every circumstance. The holding was the evidence of the decision's completeness, not the fragile silence of someone suppressing an account they want to give, but the settled silence of someone who has understood what the relationship was and what it required, and who has provided what it required, without ambivalence across the full span of its duration. What the relationship required of Penny was precisely the silence she provided. Philip's private world was a world that the institutional management had organized around the specific code of discretion that the people inside it understood and maintained. The code served Philip. It served the institutional arrangement within which the relationship existed. It served the private architecture of the marriage that the relationship was part of. Breaking the code would have served none of those purposes. It would have served only the public appetite for the kind of disclosure that the tabloid culture of the relevant period was organized around producing, and serving that appetite was not something Penny had any interest in doing. The specific content of the silence, what Penny was not saying across 4 decades, is the content that this account has been assembled to address. She was not saying that the relationship existed, and what it was, and what it meant. She was not saying that Philip had in her the specific relationship that gave him the quality of personal engagement that the institutional life consistently denied him elsewhere. She was not saying that she had been present at the end of his life, and that the presence documented the relationship's significance in the specific terms that the available evidence most clearly establishes. She was not saying any of it because the code required the not saying, and because she had understood from the beginning of the relationship what the not saying required of her, and had provided it without exception. The not saying was the gift, not the primary gift. The primary gift was the relationship itself, the specific quality of engagement that she brought to it across 4 decades, the genuine personal connection that the relationship provided Philip in the narrow private space that the institutional life left available. But the not saying was the gift that made the other gifts possible, because without the not saying, the relationship could not have been what it was in the conditions where it existed. Philip needed the code to hold. The code held because Penny held it. The holding was the specific contribution to the relationship that Penny's silence across 4 decades represents, and the contribution was as significant in its way as the relationship's positive content, the ease, the directness, the genuine engagement with Philip as himself. The silence and the relationship were inseparable. The relationship was what it was because the silence made it what it was. The palace's strategic silence at the institutional level and Penny's personal silence at the individual level were complementary and mutually reinforcing, both organized around the same outcome, the maintenance of the relationship in the private record where the code required it to remain. Penny has not given this account any material. She has not contributed to this account, or to any account that this account has drawn on. The account is assembled from the available evidence and Penny is not among the sources, because Penny has been consistently unavailable as a source across the full duration of the relevant period. The unavailability is the final expression of the decision she made and maintained. The relationship was private. The silence was the maintenance of the privacy. The maintenance continues. This account is the account that the silence was organized around preventing from being produced. The account is produced here not from Penny's disclosure, but from the record the silence left visible. The consistent documented presence, the funeral seating, the pattern of the evidence assembled across 40 years of what the palace managed not to say, and what Penny maintained in the private record where the code required it to remain. The silence was her gift to the relationship. The relationship was real. The gift sustained it. The account assembled here from what the silence left visible is the account of both. The Philip that the official account produced across the years of his public life, and that the tributes after his death consolidated into the permanent public record, is a Philip organized around the institutional dimensions of his existence: the consort's role, the Duke of Edinburgh award, the naval career, the gaffes, the longevity, the devotion to the Queen across 73 years of marriage. The organization served the institutional interest in the public account that the monarchy's presentation of itself required. The organization produced a portrait. The portrait is incomplete. The incompleteness is not the ordinary incompleteness of any public account of any significant person's life, the inevitable gap between the available evidence and the full reality of a human existence. It is the specific incompleteness of a managed account, organized around a set of institutional interests, that determined what would be included in the portrait and what would be managed into the private record, where the portrait would not have to accommodate it. What was managed into the private record was the private Philip, the man whose interior life was considerably more complicated than the official portrait allowed, whose private needs were the needs that the institutional life consistently prevented from being met within the institutional context, and whose management of those unmet needs within the narrow private space the institutional life permitted produced the specific private world that the available record documents and the official account declines to address. The honest portrait includes what the official portrait manages into silence. Philip was a man of genuine personal distinction, whose distinction the institutional role consistently subordinated to the institutional function. The naval career was genuine, and its achievement was genuine, and the subordination of it to the consort's role at age 30 was a subordination that produced in him the specific psychological tension of someone removed from their natural element and placed in a role that the element they had been removed from had not equipped them to find fully satisfying. The tension was real, and it produced specific behaviors across the public life. The impatience, the sharpness, the particular manner that the press documented as gaffe, and that the honest account reads as the pressure release of a contained tension. Philip was a man whose social intelligence was considerable, and whose deployment of it in the service of the institutional role across 70 years produced one of the most professionally consistent public performances available in the modern history of the British monarchy. The consistency was real. The professionalism was real. The performance was the product of a character that had organized itself around the decision to honor the commitments it had made, regardless of the cost, and the honoring was genuine rather than simply performed. Philip was a man who maintained across 4 decades a specific private relationship whose significance in his private life the official account has never addressed in honest terms. The relationship with Penny Knatchbull was the most sustained and the most significant personal relationship of his adult life outside the marriage. It was present at the beginning of the period this account has examined, built on the specific foundation of shared grief for the losses the 1979 bombing produced. It was present across the carriage driving decades, in the private social world of the Brabornne family, in the specific contexts where Philip's institutional identity was most consistently suspended and the private person most consistently available. It was present at the end, in the COVID bubble at Windsor in the final weeks, at the funeral in the family section, in the specific evidential statement of significance that the funeral seating arrangement produced. Philip was a man whose marriage to the Queen was the central institutional commitment of his life, and whose private architecture, alongside that marriage, included the specific relationships that the institutional commitment's constraints required him to maintain in the private spaces the constraint left available. The marriage was real. The private architecture was also real. The official account of the marriage as the exclusive emotional world of both parties is the account that the institutional management required, and that the honest account cannot sustain against the available evidence. Philip was a man who gave the institution what the institution required, and who organized, within the narrow space the institution left him, the closest available approximation to the life he would have chosen if the institutional commitment had not organized the conditions of his existence. The organization was the work of a lifetime, conducted with the intelligence and the discipline that characterized everything he did, in the specific private world that the relevant social circles made available to someone in his specific circumstances. The private world included Penny. It included the carriage driving. It included the Brabornne family's social world organized around the Mountbatten legacy that Mountbatten's death had left in the family's care. It included the specific relationships with the specific women across the decades who offered him what the institutional context could not. The engagement with Philip as himself, the knowing of the person rather than the position, the ease of being in company where the performance could be at least partially suspended. The honest portrait is not a portrait of a man who failed at the consort's role, or who betrayed the marriage, or who conducted a hidden private life at odds with the public values the institution required him to represent. The honest portrait is more complicated and more human than either the official portrait or the scandal version that the official portrait's incompleteness invites people to supply from their own imagination. The honest portrait is the portrait of a person of genuine quality who gave an institutional life everything the institutional life required, who organized within the narrow private space the institutional life permitted the closest thing to authentic existence that the specific constraints allowed, and whose management of the constraints across 99 years produced in the private record a life that was fuller and more human and more genuinely connected to other specific people than the official portrait has ever allowed the public to see. Penny was the central element of the fuller private life. The carriage driving was the primary private passion. The Brabornne world was the primary private context. The Queen was the institutional partner, and the person Philip had committed his public life to serving. The combination of all these things was the actual Philip, not the official portrait's loyal consort, not the scandal version's faithless husband, but the specific person whose private life included all of these dimensions simultaneously, and who managed the management of all of them, with the discipline and the intelligence of someone who had decided what he was doing, and was doing it completely. The honest portrait is here. It is assembled from the available evidence across the full span of the record this account has examined. It places Penny in the position the evidence documents her occupying, the center of Philip's private world across 4 decades, present at the end, seated in the family section, significant in the specific terms that the available evidence establishes beyond serious question. The palace produced the official portrait. The official portrait served the institution. This account produces the honest portrait. The honest portrait serves the person. Philip was the person. The portrait is his. Louis Mountbatten's presence in this story does not end with his death in August 1979. It extends forward through every subsequent year of the Philip and Penny relationship, shaping its context and its character in ways that the account of the relationship's origins only partially captures. Understanding how the Mountbatten shadow fell across the subsequent 4 decades requires understanding what Mountbatten actually was to Philip, not in the official biographical terms of uncle and mentor, but in the specific psychological terms of the one person who had consistently performed a function in Philip's life that nobody else had performed, and that nobody else was positioned to perform after him. Mountbatten had been Philip's father in every meaningful sense of that word, except the biological one. Prince Andrew of Greece, Philip's actual father, was a man whose life after the Greek exile of 1922 was organized around the specific miseries of a dispossessed royal, the social world of European aristocratic exile, the expensive hotels, the Monte Carlo circuit, the particular quality of a life lived on the margins of the significance it had once occupied. He was not present in Philip's formation in the ways that fathers are present when the formation is happening. He was not there for the schools, the developmental crises, the adolescent years when paternal engagement shapes the person who emerges from them. He was a figure at the periphery of Philip's life, who appeared at intervals, and whose relationship with his only son was warm enough in its way, and insufficient in every way that mattered for the formation of a person. Mountbatten filled the gap, not by design, not through any formal arrangement, but through the specific combination of genuine affection for Philip and the recognition of Philip's qualities that produced, across the years of their relationship, the dynamic of paternal investment and filial response that Philip's relationship with his actual father never generated. Mountbatten saw Philip clearly. He identified the qualities, the intelligence, the physical capability, the professional competence, the specific combination of social confidence and interior complexity that the naval career and the subsequent institutional life would develop and deploy in different ways. He advocated for Philip. He managed Philip's introduction to the royal family with the specific care of someone whose investment in the outcome was genuine rather than simply strategic. The relationship gave Philip something that the official account of his formation consistently underweights: a sustained experience of being genuinely known and genuinely valued by a significant paternal figure whose own standing in the world was sufficient to make the valuation meaningful in the specific terms that paternal valuation operates. Mountbatten was not a peripheral figure whose approval Philip could take or leave. He was the most significant man in Philip's world. At the height of his influence, one of the most significant men in the British institutional world, and his consistent investment in Philip as a person of genuine quality was the investment that gave Philip the specific kind of confidence that only the right paternal validation produces. When the bomb at Mullimore killed Mountbatten in August 1979, it killed the relationship that had been performing that function in Philip's private life. The loss was the loss of the father, in the specific psychological sense that matters regardless of the formal biological relationship. Philip was 58 years old. He had known Mountbatten as the organizing paternal figure of his adult life for 38 years. The loss at 58 of the relationship that had been performing the paternal function across those 38 years was a loss whose specific character the official accounts of Philip's response to Mountbatten's death have consistently managed into the generic language of grief without engaging with the specific psychological dimensions of what was actually being lost. Penny was there in the aftermath, not as a replacement for Mountbatten. The specific function Mountbatten had performed was not a function that the relationship with Penny replicated or was designed to replicate, but Penny was connected to the world that Mountbatten had organized, through her marriage to Norton Knatchbull and through her position in the Brabornne family that had been the center of Mountbatten's private world. The connection placed her in Philip's life at the precise moment when the relationship that had been the primary source of the paternal validation Philip had received was permanently gone, and in the circumstances, the shared grief, the shared loss, the specific quality of being together in the aftermath of the same catastrophic event, that created the conditions for the new relationship's development. The Mountbatten shadow fell across the subsequent relationship in specific ways. Philip's engagement with the Brabornne world after 1979 was an engagement with the continuation of Mountbatten's world under the family's stewardship, and the engagement carried the specific emotional weight of someone maintaining a connection to a world that had organized itself around a person who was now gone. Penny was part of that world. Her presence in it was the presence of someone who had married into it at the precise moment of its most acute crisis, who had experienced the crisis alongside the people who had organized their lives around Mountbatten, and who had built her own relationship with those people in the specific conditions of the aftermath. Philip and Penny built their relationship in the same conditions. The aftermath of the bombing was the context. The Mountbatten world's continuation under the Brabornne family's management was the setting. The shared experience of loss and recovery was the foundation. The Mountbatten shadow was the emotional weight that the setting carried, connecting the relationship to the most significant personal loss of Philip's adult life, and giving the relationship a depth of context that purely social proximity could never have produced. The carriage driving that became the primary practical expression of the relationship was itself connected to the Mountbatten world's continuation. Philip had taken up serious driving in the early 1970s, and the Windsor Great Park setting was the setting he had developed across those years into his primary private world. Penny came into that world after the bombing, in the conditions that her marriage to Norton and her position in the Brabornne family created for her. The coming in was the coming in of someone whose connection to the world was genuine, through the family she had married into, through her own genuine engagement with the horses and the sport, through the specific setting of the relationship that was organized around something both parties actually cared about. The Mountbatten shadow gave the relationship its historical depth. Philip's need for the kind of connection that Mountbatten had provided, the knowing, the valuing, the engagement with Philip as himself, rather than as the institution, was a need that the loss of Mountbatten made more acute, rather than diminishing. The relationship with Penny did not replicate Mountbatten's function. It addressed a comparable need through a different kind of relationship, in the conditions of loss that the aftermath created, with the genuine qualities that Penny brought to it in her own right. The 4 decades of the relationship's duration were the 4 decades in which the Mountbatten shadow was always present in the background, in the Broadlands occasions, in the Brabornne family's maintenance of the world that Mountbatten had organized, in the specific emotional weight that the relationship carried by virtue of its origin in the shared grief that the bombing had produced. The background presence was not a burden on the relationship. It was the depth that made the relationship more than a social connection between two people in the same social world. It was the connection to something that had mattered, through the people and the world organized around what had mattered, that gave the relationship the weight the available evidence documents it carrying across 4 decades. Mountbatten is the shadow behind the relationship. The relationship was built in the shadow's specific conditions. The relationship lasted because it was built on something real, and what made it real was partly the genuine qualities of the two people in it, and partly the specific historical and emotional context that the Mountbatten connection provided as the foundation of its development. The foundation was real. The relationship it supported was real. The 4 decades of its duration were the 4 decades of a relationship built on something solid enough to sustain what the institutional life placed on top of it across the years of its existence. Philip and Penny lived parallel lives in the specific sense that their respective primary relationships, Philip's marriage to the Queen, Penny's marriage to Lord Knatchbull, and the relationship between them existed simultaneously across the full 4 decades of the Philip and Penny connection, producing the specific architecture of two people whose primary institutional and domestic lives ran alongside a sustained personal relationship in the private spaces that the primary lives left available. The parallel lives architecture is not unusual in the specific social world that both inhabited. The English aristocracy of the 20th century had a long institutional history of managing close relationships alongside primary marriages within the framework of the relevant world's code of discretion, and the management produced across that history specific cultural norms about how such relationships were understood and accommodated that were different from the norms of the broader culture in which they were embedded. The broader culture's norms around marriage and fidelity were norms organized around the ideal of the marriage as the exclusive emotional world of the two parties to it. The expectation that the primary marriage would be the primary relationship in all senses, that close personal relationships with people outside the marriage would be understood and managed within the marriage's requirements, rather than alongside them in the separate private architecture that the aristocratic world's code was different. The specific combination of arranged or socially managed marriages, the institutional demands of the relevant social world that organized significant portions of both parties' lives independently of their personal preferences, and the long cultural tradition of managing private realities within the framework of public discretion had produced a code that accommodated close personal relationships alongside primary marriages within a specific set of understandings about what those relationships were and what they required of the people inside them. Philip had been formed in that code from birth. His formation in the European aristocratic world of his childhood, his subsequent formation in the English aristocratic world of his adult life, and his long immersion in the specific culture of the British royal family, all placed him inside the code's operative framework. The code was not a moral framework he had consciously adopted. It was the ambient understanding of the world he had grown up in and lived inside across his entire adult life, and its specific provisions around close personal relationships alongside primary marriages were provisions he had absorbed as the natural conditions of the relevant social world, rather than as explicit rules he had decided to follow. Penny had been formed in a comparable code through her marriage into the Knatchbull family and her immersion in the Brabornne world that was organized around the same aristocratic cultural framework. The code was as natural to her as it was to Philip, absorbed through the same process of immersion in a specific social world whose ambient understanding of such things was simply the way those things were managed in the relevant world. Norton Knatchbull's position in the parallel lives architecture was the position of someone formed in the same code, someone whose understanding of the relevant relationships was the understanding of the relevant social world's member, rather than the understanding of someone whose framework for marriage and its claims was organized around the broader culture's different expectations. The understanding produced the specific behavior that the available evidence documents, the sustained maintenance of a relationship with Philip that showed no evidence of the specific disturbance that genuine marital betrayal produces in the relevant relationships, across the full duration of the period in question. The Queen's position was comparable. Her own close personal relationship with Henry Porchester, the horse trainer who was the primary close male friendship of her private life outside the marriage, was managed within the same cultural code and with the same mutual understanding between the two parties to the Windsor marriage that the code made available. The management was real. The mutual understanding was real. The parallel lives architecture was the architecture of both primary relationships in the Windsor world, organized around the same cultural framework and sustained across the same decades. The parallel lives produced specific things in the people living them. For Philip, the parallel life that the Penny relationship represented was the life in which the specific needs, the institutional life prevented from being met within the institutional context, could be addressed. The need for personal engagement on the terms of the private person, rather than the institutional function. The need for the specific ease of being known as himself by someone whose knowledge was organized around his actual qualities, rather than his significance. For Penny, the parallel life that the Philip relationship represented was the life in which the specific qualities she brought to personal engagement, the directness, the genuine warmth, the specific ability to be present with another person in the way that the available accounts describe, could be directed at someone whose need for exactly those qualities was acute and genuine and consistently present across the decades of the relationship's duration. The parallel lives produced a sustained relationship. The sustaining was the product of the genuine need and the genuine qualities and the genuine compatibility of two people who had found in the narrow private space of the relevant social world the specific connection that the primary lives they were both living alongside it could not fully provide. The architecture that the parallel lives created was the architecture of a specific world's management of a specific human reality. The reality that the primary institutional and domestic lives of significant people in demanding institutional contexts do not always provide the full range of human connection that the people inside those lives need, and that the management of the gap between what the primary life provides and what the person needs is a management that the relevant social world's code has historically organized around the specific accommodation of close personal relationships alongside the primary ones, rather than within them. Philip and Penny lived inside that architecture across 4 decades. The architecture sustained them. The sustaining was real. The architecture is what the palace's strategic silence was organized around not explaining, and what the honest account is required to place in the public record, alongside the official portrait that the strategic silence protected. The parallel lives were the reality. The official portrait was the management of the reality's public account. The honest account is here, placing the reality in the record alongside the portrait that the management of the reality's account was organized around producing and protecting. Philip died in April 2021. The relationship with Penny that this account has documented across 27 preceding sections is the relationship of two people whose primary lives are now organized around the aftermath of his death, Penny continuing in the private social world of the relevant circle, the relationship's presence in the private record acknowledged within that world, and managed in strategic silence in the public one. the official portrait of Philip sustained in the public account with the same completeness that the strategic silence across 4 decades produced. The question of why the honest account of the relationship matters now, after Philip's death, in the specific contemporary context of the British monarchy's navigation of its relationship with the public in the post-Elizabeth II period, is a question worth addressing directly, rather than leaving as an implied justification for the account's production. The first reason the honest account matters now is the reason that honest accounts of powerful people's private lives always matter. The reason that the gap between the official portrait and the private reality is always worth closing when the evidence for the closing is available and the honest account serves the subject's actual legacy rather than the institution's preferred narrative about the subject. Philip's actual legacy is better served by the honest portrait than by the official one. The official portrait presents a man whose primary achievement was the complete subordination of his private life to the institutional function, the loyal consort, the devoted husband, the man who gave everything. The honest portrait presents a man of considerably greater human complexity, whose management of an extraordinary institutional constraint across 99 years included the specific private world that the official portrait declines to acknowledge, and whose management of that private world, with the intelligence and the discipline that characterized everything he did, was as significant an achievement as the public service the official portrait celebrates. The honest portrait gives Philip more credit than the official one, not less. It presents him as a person rather than a function, as someone who managed the specific human requirements of a fully lived interior life, within the extraordinary constraints of his institutional existence, rather than as someone who simply had no such requirements, or whose management of them was the management of suppression rather than of intelligent accommodation. The second reason the honest account matters now is the reason specific to the British monarchy's contemporary situation, the reason that the institution's public standing in the post-Elizabeth II period is the standing of an institution that has been publicly educated in the gap between its official accounts and the private realities those accounts manage, and whose survival in that public environment requires the honest reckoning with the gap, rather than the continued management of it. The public education has been the product of the specific events this account and the other accounts in this series have documented: the Wales marriage and its management, the Diana story and its aftermath, the Andrew situation, the Harry and Meghan departure, and its public accounts. Each episode has contributed to a public understanding of the gap between the managed account and the private reality that the managed account covers, and the accumulation of that understanding has produced the specific skeptical public that the contemporary monarchy now navigates. The Philip and Penny story is part of the same accumulation. The palace's strategic silence about the relationship across 4 decades was the management operations' contribution to the official portrait that the honest account now requires to be supplemented with the evidence the management was organized around suppressing. The honest account's production is part of the broader honest reckoning that the contemporary public environment requires, and that the continued management of the gap between official portrait and private reality consistently fails to produce. The third reason the honest account matters now is the reason specific to Philip himself, the reason that a person who gave an extraordinary institutional life deserves an extraordinary honest account of that life, rather than the managed portrait that the institution required and produced. Philip gave the institution 70 years. He gave it the name, the career, the independence, the private life on fully his own terms, that the institutional commitment permanently foreclosed. The giving was real, and the cost was real, and the person who bore the cost deserves the honest account of how the cost was borne, and what was found, in the narrow private space, the bearing of it left available. The honest account is the tribute that the managed portrait cannot be, because the managed portrait organizes itself around what the institution required of Philip rather than around what Philip actually was. What Philip actually was includes Penny Knatchbull across 4 decades. It includes the carriage driving and the Brabornne world, and the private architecture of a marriage managed alongside a sustained personal relationship within the specific cultural framework of the relevant social world. It includes the interior life that the official portrait was organized around, managing into the background of the institutional function. The interior life was Philip's life. The institutional function was what he did with it for 70 years, in service of the institution that required the doing. The honest account of both, the function and the life behind it, is the account that serves Philip's actual legacy in the terms that a person's legacy deserves, rather than in the terms that an institution's preferred narrative requires. The palace managed the official portrait for the institution. This account produces the honest portrait for Philip. The difference is the difference between an institution's interest and a person's legacy. The institution's interest was in the managed account. The person's legacy is served by the honest one. Philip was the person. The legacy is his. The honest account places the legacy where it belongs, in the full record of a fully lived private life, alongside the institutional function that the public record has always documented, and that the private record has always known, and that the honest account now places in the permanent record alongside the official portrait that the institution produced and sustained across the full duration of the life it documents. The story matters now because it has always mattered. The silence that surrounded it served the institution across 4 decades. The honest account serves the person. Philip deserved the honest account. The account is here. The record is permanent. The institution's preferred portrait sits alongside it in the public record. The honest portrait is the one the evidence supports. The evidence is assembled here. The record is what the record is.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.